She had walked through 6 towns in 11 months, and every single one of them had thrown her out. Not with stones, not with guns, with something worse, whispers that moved faster than she ever could, arriving before her boots hit the dirt of a new street, poisoning every well before she could drink from it. Evelyn Cross had learned that a woman's reputation, once shattered, didn't just follow her, it ran ahead. Wyoming was supposed to be different. Wyoming was supposed to be far enough. It wasn't. A woman with nothing left to lose stepped onto a stranger's porch and heard a baby crying inside an empty house. She had two choices: keep walking or open that door. Everything you're about to watch depended on what she did next. Like this video, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. And stay until the very end, because this one doesn't end the way you expect. The road that led to Iron Ridge Ranch was barely a road at all. It was a suggestion. Two shallow ruts worn into the earth by wagon wheels that hadn't passed through in weeks, maybe longer. The grass between them had already started reclaiming the space, growing up through the middle in thin, stubborn tufts that caught at Evelyn's bootlaces as she walked. On either side, the Wyoming plains stretched out in every direction with the kind of indifference that the frontier reserved for people who had no business being there alone. She had no business being there alone. The wind came from the north and carried real cold in it, the kind that wasn't about temperature so much as intent. It pressed through her coat like it was looking for something to ruin. Evelyn kept her chin down and her eyes on the ruts and tried not to think about how many miles it had been since the last town, or how many miles it might be to the next one, or whether her boot sole was going to hold out another day before the stitching gave up entirely on the left side where she'd worn it nearly through. She was 26 years old and she felt considerably older. The ranch appeared the way things appeared on the open plain. Suddenly, without warning, as though it had simply materialized from the flat gray light of the afternoon rather than having been built there by human hands. First the fence line, the top rail canting at an angle that said no one had straightened it in some time. Then the barn. Its red paint faded down to something closer to the color of dried blood. Then the house itself. 2 stories, good bones, the kind of place that had been built with intention once upon a time and had since been left to the slow arguments of weather and neglect. Evelyn stopped at the gate. The gate was open. Not swinging, not recently opened, just standing open the way a gate stands when no one has thought about it in a while. A single leather glove lay in the dirt just inside it, and the mud around it had dried with the glove still there, which meant it hadn't been picked up in at least a few days, probably more. She looked at the house. The house looked back at her with its dark windows, saying nothing. What she wanted was water. That was the whole of it. She wasn't planning to knock, wasn't planning to ask for food or shelter or any of the things a person in her position might reasonably need. She'd spotted a pump handle on the near side of the house from 50 yards out, and that was enough. Fill her canteen, keep walking, find wherever the next road led. She'd gotten good at not asking for more than water. She unlatched the gate and walked up the path. The pump handle was stiff from disuse, but it gave eventually, and the water that came out ran rust-colored for a moment before clearing up. She let it run over her hand, cold and clean and real, then cupped some to her mouth and felt it hit her empty stomach like a stone dropped in a well. She was filling the canteen when she heard it, not loud, not the way crying usually announced itself. This was the thin, threadbare sound of an infant that had been crying for a very long time and was beginning to run out of the energy crying required. A sound that wasn't quite a wail anymore. It had moved past wailing into something quieter and more frightening. The sound of a small thing fighting to stay present in the world without quite knowing how much longer it could keep fighting. Evelyn went still. The sound was coming from inside the house. She stood there for a moment with the canteen in her hand and the pump dripping beside her, and tried to make sense of what she was hearing. There were no lights in the windows, no smoke from the chimney, though the afternoon was cold enough that there should have been. No sound of adult movement from anywhere on the property. No footsteps, no voices, no indication that anyone was in that house who was capable of responding to what she was hearing. Just the baby. Just that terrible diminishing sound. She thought about the road. She thought about the next town, wherever it was. She thought about all the ways that walking onto someone's property uninvited could go wrong for a woman traveling alone with nothing to her name and a reputation that preceded her like a creditor. Then she heard the sound dip lower, and something in her chest made a decision before the rest of her caught up. She went to the door. She knocked first, 3 sharp raps, and got nothing. Knocked again and called out, "Hello? Anybody in there?" and got the babies crying in response and nothing else. She tried the handle and it turned without resistance, and then she was inside. The smell hit her first. It was the smell of a house where something had gone wrong and stayed wrong. Sour milk, stale air, wood ash that had gone cold in the fireplace. The entryway was dim, the curtains on the front windows drawn against the afternoon light, and it took her eyes a moment to adjust. When they did, she took in the state of the room in pieces. Dishes on the table from a meal that had been eaten, she couldn't tell when. A child's coat on the floor near the stairs, one sleeve inside out. Candle stubs burned all the way down. Firewood stacked near the hearth, but no fire built, and the room cold enough that she could see her own breath. "Hello," she said again, because she didn't know what else to do. "Up here." The voice came from the top of the stairs. Small, female. Terrified in the way children got when they'd been holding things together past the point where they had any business holding things together. Evelyn went up the stairs. The hallway at the top was dark, one door closed at the end, another standing open and spilling a pale gray light from a window. She went toward the open door and found the baby. The infant was in a wooden crib against the far wall, and the sight of her stopped Evelyn in the doorway for half a second. She was tiny, couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 months, maybe less, and she was flushed the deep, alarming red of a fever that had been running too long. Her small hands were clenched at her sides, and her eyes were glassy and half open, and the sound she was making was not crying so much as it was the biological insistence of a body that wasn't ready to give up. Sitting on the floor beside the crib, her back against the wall and her knees drawn to her chest, was a girl of about 8. Dark hair, dark eyes, a face that had the stricken, exhausted look of someone who had been awake for much too long doing something they didn't know how to do. "She won't stop," the girl said. Her voice was absolutely steady, and it was one of the saddest things Evelyn had ever heard. A child who'd already cried herself through to the other side of crying and come out into something quieter and worse. "How long has she been like this?" "Since yesterday morning." The girl pulled her knees tighter. "Papa went to get medicine. He said he'd be back by dark." "What time did he leave?" "Yesterday." A pause. "Yesterday morning." Evelyn came into the room and put her hand on the baby's forehead and felt the heat radiating off her skin like a small furnace, and something in her went very calm and very focused in the particular way that happened sometimes when a situation was bad enough that panic became a luxury she couldn't afford. "What's her name?" "Rosie." The girl watched her with those exhausted, guarded eyes. "I'm Clara." "Evelyn." She looked around the room quickly, cataloging. "Is there any water in the house?" "Cool water, not from the kettle." "The bucket in the kitchen." "Is there a cloth? Old rags, anything like that?" Clara unwound herself from the floor and went to a small chest near the window and pulled out 2 pieces of flannel that looked like they'd been torn from something larger. She handed them to Evelyn without being asked twice, which told Evelyn something about the girl. She was the kind of child who, when she understood what was needed, moved. "Good," Evelyn said. "Go get me that bucket." Clara went. Evelyn picked up Rosie. The baby was limp in a way that frightened her. Not the limp of sleep, but the limp of exhaustion, of a small body that had been working too hard for too long. She was soaked through her wrappings. Evelyn held her against her shoulder and felt the fever burning through the cloth and started talking to her in a low, even voice. Nothing in particular, just words, just sound, just the basic animal comfort of being told by another creature that you were not alone. Clara came back with the bucket. Evelyn wet one of the flannel pieces and began working on bringing the fever down the only way she knew how, cloth to the forehead, to the back of the neck, to the small wrists. Change it when it warmed. Change it again. Talk. Don't stop moving. Don't let the quiet become the kind of quiet that meant something had gone wrong. "Is there any food?" she asked Clara. "Some." "Did you eat today?" A pause that was its own answer. "When I get Rosie settled, you're going to show me what's in the kitchen," Evelyn said. "And then you're going to eat something, all right?" Clara looked at her with those dark, watchful eyes. "Who are you?" "I told you, Evelyn." "I know your name. I mean, who are you? Papa doesn't know you're here." "No," Evelyn agreed. "He doesn't." Are you going to stay? She looked down at the baby in her arms, at the fever-flushed face and the tiny clenched hands, and thought about the road she'd been walking and the canteen she'd been filling and the next town she didn't know the name of. I'm going to stay, she said, until your papa gets back. He got back 4 hours later, just after dark. Evelyn heard the horse before she heard anything else. The stumbling rhythm of an animal that had been pushed hard and was coming in on fumes. She'd gotten the fire built by then, had coaxed some broth into Clara from a pot she'd found in the kitchen, and had spent 3 hours in that bedroom with Rosie, changing cloths, keeping the fever from climbing, talking the baby through the worst of it. The fever had come down 2 degrees, maybe 3. Not out of danger, but no longer the immediate catastrophe it had been when she'd first walked through that door. She heard the horse stop outside, heard the unsteady sound of boots hitting the porch steps, not falling, but close. And then the front door opened and the man came in. He was tall, or he would have been, under different circumstances. Right now he was bent against exhaustion and cold in the way of a tree that had taken too much wind, holding himself upright through sheer mechanical effort rather than any real structural integrity. His coat was stiff with ice along the shoulders. His face, when he turned toward the light of the fire, was the gray-white of someone who had come very close to something bad and hadn't entirely processed what that meant yet. He saw her and stopped. He had a brown paper package in his hand. Medicine, she assumed, from a doctor or a general store, whoever he'd found willing to help. He held it out slightly, like he'd forgotten he was carrying it. "Who the hell are you?" he said. Not a question, not quite. More like a man reading a sentence out loud and trying to understand what language it was in. "My name's Evelyn Cross. I was passing through and I heard your baby." She kept her voice level, kept her hands visible, kept herself still in the way she'd learned you had to keep yourself still when a person was frightened and confused and not entirely thinking straight. "She's upstairs. Fever broke some about an hour ago. She took a little water." He stared at her for a long moment. "Rosie," he said. "Yes." He moved past her toward the stairs, and she stepped aside and let him go. She heard his boots on the steps, heard the creak of the door, heard, very faintly, the sound of a man making a sound that wasn't quite a word, the kind of sound that came from somewhere that didn't have words yet. Clara appeared at the kitchen doorway and looked at Evelyn. "He came back," she said. "He came back," Evelyn agreed. His name was Silas Boone, and Evelyn learned this from Clara before she learned it from him. Clara talked, it turned out, not the way frightened, lonely children sometimes talked, in a torrent of words released after too long under pressure, but carefully, selectively, in the considered way of someone who had decided that information was something to be measured out rather than spilled. She told Evelyn her father's name. She told her that her mother had died in the spring, March, she said, and said it the way you said a thing you'd made yourself get used to saying, even though you hadn't gotten used to it at all. She told her that Rosie had been sick before, not this sick, and that their Uncle Wade came by sometimes but hadn't been by in 3 weeks. She didn't tell Evelyn why her father had been gone so long, or what the road to the nearest town had cost him, but Evelyn could see the shape of that story in the stiffness of his movements when he came back downstairs, in the way he held himself like a man keeping inventory of his own damage. He sat down at the kitchen table across from her because there wasn't anywhere else to sit, and said, "I need to thank you." "You don't," Evelyn said. "I do." He looked at the table. He hadn't taken off his coat yet. Either he'd forgotten or he was still deciding something. "Clara says you've been here since afternoon. Since about 2. Rosie was, He stopped, started again. "When I left, she wasn't that bad yet. I thought I had time." "The fever moves fast in babies," Evelyn said. "You couldn't have known." "I knew." He said it quietly, without self-pity, which made it worse somehow. Just a statement of fact. He'd known. He'd weighed the risk. He'd made the call, and the call had nearly cost him something he couldn't afford to lose. "I should have gone sooner." "You went," Evelyn said. "You went 20 miles in the dark in that weather to get medicine for her, and you made it back." He looked at her then, really looked at her for the first time, she thought, instead of just registering her presence as a thing requiring explanation. He had dark eyes, the kind that were hard to read in firelight, and a face that had been weathered enough by the frontier that you couldn't quite pin an age to it. Somewhere in his mid-30s, maybe. Tired in the permanent way, not the temporary way. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "I don't know yet." She said it simply, without embarrassment. On the frontier, not knowing where you were headed was common enough that it didn't require apology. He looked at her for a moment, looked at the stove where she'd banked the fire before coming down, looked at the pot she'd washed and left drying by the basin. "You can sleep in the room at the end of the hall," he said. "It's cold, but there's a blanket. I'll pay you for your time." "You don't have to pay me. I'll pay you," he said again. Not arguing, just deciding. She let him. She was tired enough that gratitude felt like a full meal, and she was not in a position to refuse either. She told herself she would leave in 2 days. 2 days became 3. 3 became a week. The thing was, the ranch needed work in a way that went beyond any single person's ability to fix quickly, and Evelyn was not constitutionally able to leave a thing broken when she could see exactly how it needed to be repaired. It had always been a problem with her. She saw what was wrong, and she saw what needed doing, and her hands moved before her head gave them permission. The house had been running on whatever Clara could manage and whatever Silas had energy for after a day of ranch work, which was not enough and couldn't be. The kitchen was disorganized in the way of a space where things had been set down in moments of crisis and never put back in any logical order. The pantry had food in it, but nothing planned. Half a sack of cornmeal, some salt pork, dried beans, a crock of lard that had gone slightly off on top. She cleaned the surface of the lard and worked with the rest. She cooked, she cleaned, she organized the pantry by what needed using first and what could wait. She fixed the draft on the fireplace by adjusting the flue in a way that someone who didn't know chimneys would never have thought to try. She found a pile of mending in a basket near Clara's room and sat down with a needle and thread one evening and worked through it without being asked. Clara watched her. Rosie recovered. The baby came back to herself over the course of those first few days the way infants did. Suddenly, completely, with an apparent total lack of awareness of how serious the situation had been. By the 4th day, she was sitting up in her crib making sounds at a cloth toy, and by the 6th, she had apparently decided that Evelyn was acceptable and reached for her when Evelyn came into the room, which was the kind of small endorsement that cost nothing and meant everything. Silas watched her too, but differently from Clara. Where Clara watched with the calculating attention of someone building a case, gathering evidence, weighing it, holding it, Silas watched the way a man watched something he didn't quite trust himself to understand. She'd catch him looking sometimes when she came in from the yard or turned away from the stove, and he'd look away the moment she noticed, not caught exactly, but acknowledging the notice. He was not an easy man to talk to. He wasn't unfriendly. He answered questions directly, said thank you when it was warranted, told her where things were when she asked. But he didn't offer much beyond what was asked for, and there was a quality to his silences that wasn't quite sadness and wasn't quite anger, and was probably something in the territory between the two that didn't have a name yet. One evening, about 10 days in, she found him in the barn past dark, when she went out to check on the horses. She'd noticed one of them favoring a foreleg that afternoon and wanted to look at it again. He was sitting on a crate in the far corner with a piece of tack across his knees, not working on it, just holding it. The lantern on the post threw long shadows across the stall doors. He looked up when she came in. "I'm sorry," he said immediately, which was not what she'd expected. "I meant to get to the bay's leg this afternoon." "I know you did." She went to the bay and ran her hand down the leg in question, felt it for heat. "Not bad. She'd seen worse." "I can wrap it tonight. I've done it before." He watched her work. She could feel his eyes on her back in that way she'd gotten used to with him. Not intrusive, just present. "My wife used to do that," he said after a while. "Tend the horses. She was better with animals than I ever was." It was the first time he'd mentioned his wife directly to Evelyn. She kept her hands on the horse's leg and let the silence do its work, because she'd learned that was the right thing to do when someone was working up to something. "Her name was Hannah," he said. "She died in March. Rosie was barely 3 months old." "I know," Evelyn said quietly. "Clara told me. Clara tells you things. Some things." He was quiet for a moment. She finished with the wrapping and straightened up and turned around, and he was looking at the tack in his hands instead of at her. "I don't know what I'm doing," he said. "Half the time I don't even I look at Rosie and I think, Hannah would know exactly what to do right now, and I don't have the first idea. He stopped. I don't know why I'm telling you this. Because it's late and you're tired and there's no one else to tell it to, Evelyn said. Not unkind, just direct. He looked at her. Something shifted in his face, not softening exactly, more like the easing of a held breath. Yeah, he said. That's probably it. She let the horse go and picked up the lantern from the post and headed for the barn door. You're not doing as badly as you think, she said. Clara knows where everything is in this house. She knows her little sister's schedule. She knows how to ask for help when she needs it. She paused in the doorway. Children learn that from someone. She went back to the house before he could answer, because she hadn't meant it as a conversation, and she'd said enough. On the 14th day, she tried to leave. She told herself she'd done what she'd come to do. Rosie was well. The house was in order. Silas Boone was no longer operating in the suspended, half-conscious state of a man moving through the world in shock. Things were functioning. She had no claim on this place and no reason to stay. She had her pack on her shoulder and was at the gate when she heard boots behind her on the frozen ground. It was Clara. The girl came up to the gate and stopped and looked at her with those dark, measuring eyes, and she didn't say anything for a moment, just looked. Where are you going? She said finally. Down the road. Evelyn kept her voice easy. I've stayed long enough. Papa didn't say you had to go. I know. I didn't say you had to go either. Evelyn shifted the pack on her shoulder and looked out at the road. The same two ruts that had brought her here, winding away into the flat gray distance, leading to wherever it led. She thought about the last town. She thought about the town before that. She thought about what it felt like to walk into a place and feel the temperature of the room drop as the word moved from person to person. And the look on the face of the woman at the general store who'd told her there were no rooms available when Evelyn had seen with her own eyes that there were. I have to keep moving, she said. That's just how it is for me right now. Why? Clara asked. And there it was. The plain, unadorned question that children asked without understanding why adults found it so hard to answer. Because the story that followed her was bigger than she was, and she'd never figured out how to get in front of it. Because 11 months of walking had taught her that there was no town far enough, and no fresh start clean enough, and no amount of hard work that could outrun a lie once it had gotten its legs under it. Because she was tired, bone tired, and she didn't know how to stop being tired when stopping meant standing still long enough for the story to catch up. She didn't say any of that. It's complicated, she said. Claire considered this. Then she said, Rosie cried for you last night when you put her to bed. Evelyn turned to look at her. She woke up at midnight and Papa couldn't settle her, Clara said. He came to get me and I couldn't settle her either. She kept reaching toward the door. A pause. She does that when she wants you. It was entirely possible that Clara was a shrewd 8-year-old who understood exactly what she was doing. It was equally possible that she was simply telling the truth, plainly and without strategy, the way children told the truth when they hadn't yet learned to dress it up or pull its punches. Either way, it worked. Evelyn stood at the gate for another long moment. Then she set her pack down. Then she picked it up again and walked back through the gate, and Clara walked beside her back to the house, and neither of them said anything else about it. She had been at the ranch for 3 weeks when Wade Boone arrived. She knew him the moment she saw him, not because she'd ever met him, but because she recognized the type. The kind of man who had decided things about the world and about people in it, and didn't find it necessary to reconsider those decisions in light of new evidence. He rode in on a gray horse mid-afternoon, and he was big in the way Silas was tall. Silas's height redirected somehow into breadth and authority. He wore his coat like armor. He pulled up at the gate and looked at the yard and saw Evelyn coming from the chicken coop with a basket, and he looked at her the way a person looked at something unexpected and not entirely welcome. "Who are you?" he called. She met his eyes and felt the cold certainty of recognition move through her, even though she'd never seen his face. She'd seen that face before. Different man, same face. The face of someone who had already made up his mind. "Evelyn Cross," she said. "I work here." He looked at the house. He looked at her. He dismounted with the deliberate care of a man who took his time because he knew the world would wait for him, and he came through the gate without being invited. "Wade Boone," he said, not offering a hand. "Silas's brother." I know who you are. Clara told me you'd be coming by. He stopped a few feet from her. He had the same dark eyes as Silas, but where Silas's eyes were watchful and private, Wade's were assessing in a more deliberate way, the eyes of a man adding up a column of numbers. "Where's my brother?" he said. "North fence. He said he'd be back before supper." Wade looked at the basket in her hand, looked at the house again. "How long have you been here?" 3 weeks. Something moved behind his eyes. He looked at her more carefully then, the way you looked at something when you thought you'd seen it before and were trying to place it. "Cross," he said slowly, like he was testing the word. She held his gaze. "Evelyn Cross." He said the name fully this time, and she watched the moment when it connected, when whatever he knew, or thought he knew, found the right drawer in his memory and dropped into place. His expression didn't change exactly, but it closed, like a door being pulled shut without being slammed. "You know the name," she said. "I've heard it." He looked at her for a moment, and she could see him calculating, not whether the rumors were true, she thought, but what to do with them. "We should probably talk before Silas gets back." "Probably," she agreed. They stood in the yard in the cold afternoon light, and she waited for what was coming because she'd been waiting for it for 11 months, and the only thing worse than waiting was the uncertainty of not knowing when. He said it plainly, without cruelty and without mercy, which was its own kind of approach. He'd heard the story from a man in Casper who'd heard it from a man in Laramie, and the version he'd heard was the one that had been traveling the territory for the better part of 2 years. The story of a woman who had destroyed a man's family, broken a marriage, worked her way into a household, and left wreckage behind when she was done. "I know how it sounds," he said when he finished, "but Silas has 2 daughters, and he just lost his wife. He's not in a position to—" "I know," she said. He stopped. "I know how the story sounds," she said. "I've heard it." She set the basket down on the fence post beside her and crossed her arms against the cold. "I'm not going to tell you it isn't true, because you wouldn't believe me if I did. And I'm not going to ask you to believe me. But I'll tell you this. Your brother's baby almost died 3 weeks ago, and the only reason she didn't is because I was here and I stayed when I didn't have to. You can make of that whatever you want." Wade looked at her for a long time. "I want you gone before Silas gets back," he said. I know you do." She picked up the basket. "But that's not your choice." She went back to the house, and she didn't look behind her, and she didn't let herself think too hard about the way her hands had gone cold inside her gloves in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. Silas came in from the fence line as the light was going and found his brother at the kitchen table and his housekeeper at the stove, and the silence in the room when he came through the door was the particular silence of 2 people who had been talking and had stopped very recently. He looked at Wade. He looked at Evelyn. "All right," he said, setting down his tools by the door. "Somebody tell me what I've walked into." "Nothing," Evelyn said. "Supper's nearly ready." "Wade," Silas said. Wade looked at his brother with an expression that Evelyn read, without being able to see his face directly, as the expression of a man deciding how to have a conversation he knew wasn't going to go the way he wanted. "I was just getting acquainted," he said. "With your new hired hand." "She's not a hired hand," Silas said, and then seemed to hear how that sounded because he added, "She's been helping with the children. She's been—" He stopped. "It's complicated." "Yeah," Wade said. "I'm beginning to see that." Evelyn put 3 plates on the table and called for Clara and said nothing else. And the meal went the way meals went in houses where something unresolved was sitting at the table with everyone else. Too politely, with pauses in the wrong places and subjects that kept getting changed just before they got to wherever they were going. Clara ate without noticing or pretended not to notice, which amounted to the same thing. After supper, Wade offered to help clear the table, which surprised Evelyn and seemed to surprise Silas. He carried plates to the basin without being asked and then stood at the kitchen doorway with his coat back on, ready to go, and he looked at Evelyn one more time. "You'll think about what I said," he said. "I will," she said. Which was true. She'd be thinking about it for a long time. He nodded once and went out. Silas sat at the table after he'd gone, his hands flat on the surface, looking at the middle distance. Clara had taken Rosie upstairs. The fire in the stove had burned down to coals. "What did he say?" Silas asked. Evelyn was washing the plates. She kept her hands in the water. He told me I should leave. Silas was quiet for a moment. And you said? I said it wasn't his choice. Another pause. She couldn't see his face from where she was standing. Is it your choice? He asked. Whether to stay? She thought about the road. She thought about the gate she'd turned back from, and Clara walking beside her, and the image of Rosie reaching toward a closed door at midnight looking for someone who wasn't there. For now, she said, I think it is. She heard him exhale. Not quite relief. Not quite anything she could name with certainty. Just breath. All right, he said. She finished with the plates and dried her hands on the cloth by the basin and said good night, and she went up the stairs to the cold room at the end of the hall with the single blanket and the window that looked out over the north field. And she lay down in her clothes because the room was cold enough to warrant it, and she stared at the ceiling in the dark. Outside, the Wyoming wind was picking up. She could hear it working at the eaves, testing the corners of the house, doing what weather did when it wanted to remind you that it had been there before you and would be there after. She pulled the blanket up. She was still there. For now, that was enough. Wade Boone left before sunrise the next morning. Evelyn heard his horse before she was fully awake. The particular rhythm of hooves on frozen ground moving at a pace that said the rider wanted distance rather than just destination. She lay still in the dark of the end room and listened to the sound fade, and then she listened to the house settle back into its nighttime quiet. And then she got up because lying still had never been something she was any good at. The kitchen was cold. She built the fire in the stove the way she'd been building it for 3 weeks now. Paper first, then the small wood, then the split logs once the kindling was committed. It was a mechanical process, the kind of thing her hands did without consultation from her head. And she was grateful for that because her head was busy doing other things. Wade knew. Not everything. She didn't think he had the whole story. Nobody had the whole story except her and the man who'd started it, and possibly 2 or 3 people who'd been close enough to watch the beginning of it. But he had enough. He had the version that traveled, the version with the sharp edges and the easy villain, and he'd believed it the way people believe things they heard from a trustworthy source about a person they didn't know, which was completely, without gaps. She stood at the stove and watched the fire catch, and thought about what that meant. Wade would come back. That much was certain. He was the kind of man who didn't let things sit when he thought they needed resolving, and he hadn't resolved this to his satisfaction. He'd made his position clear. She'd refused to vacate it, and Silas had come home and the conversation had been tabled by the presence of supper and children. That wasn't an ending. That was an intermission. She heard Rosie's voice from upstairs, the particular conversational babbling of a baby who had woken up and had opinions about it, and pushed the Wade problem to the back of her mind because Rosie was immediate and Wade was eventual, and she'd learned that you managed immediate things first. By the time Silas came downstairs, there was coffee on and oatmeal in the pot, and Rosie was sitting in the wooden chair they'd rigged with a board across the arms to keep her in, banging a spoon against the tray with the dedicated focus of someone who had discovered percussion and considered it a calling. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the scene with the same expression he'd been wearing for 3 weeks. The expression of a man who kept arriving in his own kitchen to find it more functional than he'd left it, and who hadn't entirely decided how he felt about that. You didn't have to, he started. I know, Evelyn said. Coffee's hot. He came in and poured himself a cup and sat down across from Rosie, and the baby looked at him and banged her spoon twice more, as if making a point. And he almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the muscular suggestion of one, the face remembering how the motion worked. Wade gone? Evelyn asked. His horse is gone. Silas wrapped both hands around the mug. He'll be back. I figured. He looked at her over the rim of his cup. He tell you what he said to you? He did. And you didn't? He stopped. Started again. You're still here. I'm still here. He set the mug down. He had the look of a man assembling a question carefully, like someone picking up pieces of something fragile. What did he tell you, that he said to you, out in the yard? Evelyn was quiet for a moment, deciding. He told me he'd heard things about me, she said, and that he thought it would be better for your family if I wasn't around. Silas looked at the table. What kind of things? The kind that travel. She said it plainly, without apology and without drama. the way she'd learned to say it, because the alternative was performing grief about it, and she'd used up her grief about it about 6 months ago. I'm not going to pretend I don't know what he heard. I've been in enough towns to know exactly what version of my story gets there before I do. Silas was quiet. You don't have to tell me, it's none of my business, he said finally. It's not that. She spooned oatmeal into 2 bowls and brought them to the table and sat down. It's that explaining it doesn't help. I've tried explaining it. People hear what they want to hear. I'm not people, he said. Not with heat, just as a statement. She looked at him. He was looking back at her steadily, without the wariness she'd expected, without the careful neutrality that was its own kind of judgment, just looking the way he sometimes did when he thought she didn't notice. No, she said. I suppose you're not. But she didn't tell him. Not then. The words were there. She'd arranged them and rearranged them in her head 100 times on 100 empty roads, the way you rehearsed a conversation you kept meaning to have. But the morning was ordinary, and the baby was hitting the tray with a spoon, and Clara would be down any minute. And something about the simplicity of that made her want to leave the complicated thing alone for 1 more hour. 1 more hour became 1 more day. That was how she'd been managing it for nearly 2 years. The work of the ranch was not gentle work, and it didn't become gentle just because she was doing it, but Evelyn had never particularly wanted gentle. She'd grown up with her hands in things. Her father's farm first, then the household she'd worked in at 17, then 2 years of managing a boarding house in Laramie before everything came apart. She knew how to get up before dawn and make the day do what it needed to do, and that knowledge was the one thing the rumors couldn't touch. She mucked the stalls because they needed mucking. She patched the section of fence on the south side that had been leaning wrong since she'd arrived and would eventually fall if someone didn't see to it. She got the pantry organized so that things that needed using were in front and things that would keep were behind, and she made sure there was always something warm on the stove by the time Silas came in from the fields. Not because she'd been asked to, but because a man doing physical labor in November temperatures needed hot food the way a fire needed air. None of it was strategy. That was what she would have had to explain to Wade if he'd been willing to hear it. She wasn't working her way into anything. She was just doing what was in front of her, because doing what was in front of her was the only skill she'd been able to hold on to through everything else. Clara watched her. The girl had a talent for watching that was either impressive or slightly unnerving depending on the day. She was present without being underfoot. She'd appear at Evelyn's elbow while Evelyn was mending tack or kneading bread or sorting the medicine chest, and she'd watch with the focused, silent attention of someone who was filing everything away for later use. She didn't ask many questions, but the ones she asked were direct. "Did you always know how to do all this stuff?" she asked one afternoon, sitting on the kitchen counter while Evelyn worked the bread dough. "Most of it. I learned the rest." "Where?" "Different places. I moved around a lot." Clara turned this over. "Why?" Evelyn pushed the heels of her hands into the dough. "Sometimes you don't get to choose where you go. Things happen and you go where you can go." "Did things happen to you?" "Yes." "Bad things?" "Some." Clara was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Mama used to make bread on Tuesdays." There was nothing to say to that, so Evelyn didn't try. She just kept working the dough, and after a moment Clara started talking about her mother the way she sometimes did, in fragments, in the specific details that children remembered rather than the general impressions that adults held on to. Hannah Boone had made bread on Tuesdays. She had sung while she worked, but never remembered the words past the first verse of anything. She had been afraid of the dark when she was small, but she'd made herself go out at night anyway, because she said you couldn't let fears run the house or they'd take over. Evelyn listened to all of it. By the end of the 3rd week, Clara had started sitting with her in the evenings. Not talking usually, just present. She'd bring a book or some small thing to occupy her hands, and she'd sit near the lamp while Evelyn mended or worked on accounts, or wrote out the list of things the ranch needed from town. It was a quiet kind of trust, the kind that didn't announce itself. Just proximity, chosen repeatedly. Evelyn didn't say anything about it because saying anything about it would have broken whatever it was. You couldn't name those things, or they spooked. Rosie required less analysis. Rosie had made her decision in the 1st week and had not reconsidered it. She reached for Evelyn with the frank, total confidence of an infant who had identified the person she wanted and saw no reason to be subtle about it. She fell asleep against Evelyn's shoulder with her small fist curled into the fabric of Evelyn's shirt, and she woke up and looked for her with the certainty of someone who had arranged the world according to her needs and expected it to comply. It was harder in some ways than Clara's careful watching. Clara's trust was provisional. It was being extended on the understanding that it could be withdrawn if the evidence warranted. Rosie's was absolute, and absolute trust from someone with no capacity to protect itself was a weight of a particular kind. Evelyn held her, and felt that weight, and tried not to think too directly about it. She was in the barn, rehanging the door on the second stall, when she heard the wagon come in, not Wade. The rhythm was different, heavier, a team of horses rather than a single mount. She set down the hinge and came out to look and found a woman climbing down from a buckboard with the brisk efficiency of someone who considered the act of dismounting an inconvenience rather than an event. She was somewhere in her 60s, broad-shouldered, with gray hair pulled back with a pin that was doing its level best under difficult circumstances. "That the Boone place?" the woman called. "It is. You the one who's been keeping it together?" She said it matter-of-factly, without particularly being a compliment. "I work here," Evelyn said. The woman came through the gate and looked at the yard and the house with the appraising eye of someone who had seen both in worse condition and was adjusting her expectations accordingly. "Mabel Harding," she said. "My place is 6 miles east. I used to bring Hannah preserves in the fall." She looked at Evelyn. "Heard Silas had taken someone on. Wanted to see for myself." Evelyn cross. Mabel Harding looked at her with the kind of look that was taking inventory without being rude about it. "You from around here?" "No." "Passing through?" Evelyn hesitated. "I was." The woman nodded once, as if that answered something. "You make coffee." They sat at the kitchen table with coffee while Rosie slept and Clara was at her lessons in the front room, and Mabel Harding talked in the direct, unsentimental way of a woman who had been on the frontier long enough to consider small talk a waste of available time. She talked about the winter coming. Harder than last year, she thought. The signs were there if you knew how to read them. She talked about the price of feed and the state of the road between the ranches and the fact that the nearest doctor was in Grover Falls, which was 20 miles on a good day and considerably more on a bad one. She talked about Hannah Boone. "Good woman," she said. "Practical. Didn't complain about things she couldn't change." She looked at her coffee cup. "Silas took it hard. Harder than he let on, which for a man like Silas is saying something, because he doesn't let on much to begin with." "No," Evelyn agreed. "He doesn't." "He eating?" "Getting there." "Sleeping?" "I don't know his sleeping, but he's up before dawn and he's working, if that tells you anything." Mabel considered this. "It tells me he's functional. That's not the same as fine, but it's somewhere to start." She looked at Evelyn with those inventory eyes. "You know how to read winter signs? The ones I mentioned." "Some of them. There's a bad one coming." She said it without drama, which made it worse. "Not this week, maybe not next, but before January. You make sure that house is stocked and that woodpile is doubled. Don't let him tell you it'll be fine. Men always think it'll be fine until they're 6 feet under a drift." Evelyn almost smiled. "I'll make sure." Mabel finished her coffee and stood up with the same brisk efficiency she'd used to get down from the buckboard. And she went to the door and then stopped and turned back. "People around here aren't going to be easy on you," she said. It wasn't unkind. It was the same tone she'd used about the weather. "Word travels. Doesn't matter what's true, matters what's said. You're a single woman working on a widower's ranch, and that's enough for people to make stories, even without whatever else they might have to work with." Evelyn kept her face still. "I know. I'm not telling you to leave," Mabel said. "I'm telling you it'll be harder than just the work." She put on her hat. "Those children look better than the last time I saw them. That's not nothing." She left. Evelyn listened to the buckboard move out of the yard and sat alone at the table with the 2 empty cups and thought about what Mabel had said about winter. She'd already been thinking about the woodpile. The day she and Silas finally talked about it, really talked, not the careful circling they'd been doing, was the day she burned the biscuits. It was not a thing she did. She did not burn biscuits. She had been making biscuits since she was 12 years old, and she had never, in 14 years, burned biscuits. And the fact that she burned them on this particular afternoon was a direct consequence of the fact that she was thinking about something she should not have been thinking about instead of watching the oven, and she did not find this dignifying. She was pulling the pan out with a cloth when Silas came in from the barn, and the look on his face when he saw the black-bottom biscuits was the closest thing to genuine amusement she'd seen on him in a month. "Don't," she said. "I didn't say anything." "You were thinking something." "I was thinking that's the first thing I've seen go wrong in here since you arrived." He hung his coat on the peg and came to the stove and looked at the biscuits with the seriousness of a man conducting an assessment. "They're not completely gone. The tops are fine." "The tops are fine and the bottoms are charcoal. We can eat the tops." She looked at him. He looked back, and that almost smile was there again, closer to the surface than usual. She didn't quite know what to do with it. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make more." "You don't have to make more." "I know I don't have to. Sit down." He sat. She started the biscuit process again, and the kitchen was quiet except for the stove and Rosie's sounds from the front room where Clara was watching her, and after a while Silas said, "You were distracted." "Yes." "By what?" She kept her hands in the flour. This was the moment. She knew it even as it was happening. The way you sometimes knew things were shifting while they were shifting rather than after. She could redirect. She was good at redirecting. "Something your brother said," she said instead. The quality of the silence changed. "Which part of what he said?" Silas asked. "The part he believed." She worked the butter into the flour. "He wasn't wrong to be worried. I want you to know I understand that. He's looking out for his brother's family. That's the right thing to be doing." She stopped. "What he heard about me isn't a lie. Not entirely. There was a situation 2 years ago, and what happened was, the outcome of it was a story that went a direction I couldn't control." She paused again. "I was working in a household in Laramie. A family. The man he was well regarded. Important. He had a wife and children and a position in that town." She looked at the dough. "He decided things about me that I didn't agree to. And when I made clear I didn't agree to them, he found it more convenient to have a different version of events." The kitchen was absolutely quiet. "He said you came after him," Silas said. Not a question. He was repeating what Wade had told him, she realized, which meant Wade had talked to Silas before he'd come to her. Or after. Probably both. "Yes." And the wife believed it. The wife believed it. The town believed it. His version was better than mine. He was someone, and I was nobody, and nobody had any reason to take my word over his. She pressed the dough out with her palm. "I left before things got worse than they already were. I thought putting distance between me and Laramie would help. It helped a little. Not enough." Silas was quiet for a long time. She could feel him deciding things, and she kept her hands busy so she didn't have to look at him while he decided. "That man's name," he said finally. "It doesn't matter." "It matters to me." "It shouldn't." She looked up then, because she needed him to hear this part. "I don't want you getting in front of something on my behalf. That's not—" She stopped. "That's not what this is." "What is it then?" She looked at him across the kitchen, and for a moment she didn't have a prepared answer for that. She'd been managing this question for 11 months. What was she doing? What did she want? What was she looking for? And she'd always been able to keep it abstract, keep it directional, keep it pointed toward some undefined somewhere else. Standing in his kitchen with flour on her hands and burned biscuits on the counter, she found the abstraction had run out. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I know I'm not running from you. I know this place." She stopped, started over. "I know that your daughters are good, and I know that I'm not going anywhere right now." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "The man in Laramie, he's still there?" "Last I heard." "And his story is still going?" "It's had 2 years to travel, so yes." Silas nodded once, slowly, the way he nodded when he was absorbing information and folding it into whatever internal structure he used to make sense of things. He didn't say anything else for a while, and she finished the biscuits and put them in the oven, and this time she watched them. When they came out right, he was still at the table. "Wade's coming back next week," he said. "I know. He's going to push harder." "I know that too." He looked at his hands. "I'm not going to ask you to go," he said. It came out plainly, without performance, the way he said most things. "I want to be clear about that. Whatever Wade says when he comes, that's my call to make, not his. She set the plate of biscuits on the table between them and sat down. You might change your mind, she said, when he tells you more. He told me plenty already. He took a biscuit. I'm still here. She looked at him. He looked back, and the almost smile was completely gone now, replaced by something quieter and more settled. The face of a man who had made a decision and was not anxious about it. She took a biscuit. She didn't say anything else, and neither did he, and they ate in the kind of silence that had shifted from uneasy to something else. Something that didn't need filling. Bah. Wade came back on a Thursday. He rode in mid-morning, and Evelyn saw him from the kitchen window, and for a moment she just stood there and watched him dismount and tie his horse and come through the gate. He moved with the same measured deliberateness as before, but something in his posture was different, not softer, not harder, more prepared maybe. The posture of a man who had thought about what he was going to say. She went to the door and opened it before he had to knock. Silas is out, she said. I know. I saw him on the road coming in. He looked at her steadily. Can I come in? She stepped back and let him. He didn't sit. He stood in the kitchen with his hat in his hands, which was a different gesture than before. Before he'd kept the hat on. She noticed the difference without being sure what it meant. I did some asking around, he said. About you. About what happened in Laramie. She kept her face even. All right. The man's name was Prescott, he said. Edmund Prescott. She said nothing. I know a man who knew someone who worked in that house, Wade said. Not the family, the staff. A woman named Ruth who left Laramie about 6 months after you did. He looked at his hat, then at her. She told a different version. Evelyn held still. She said Prescott had a way of doing things, Wade said carefully, and that you weren't the first and you weren't the last. She said what he did to your name was, she called it deliberate. She said he was good at it. The kitchen was very quiet. Why are you telling me this? Evelyn asked. Because I came here last week ready to push you out of my brother's house, and I did it based on a story I'd heard secondhand from a man who'd heard it third, Wade said. And that's not... He stopped. That's not how I like to operate. He looked at her directly. I'm not saying I'm not still worried about Silas. I am. He's not in a position to be thinking straight about anything right now, and having you here makes things more complicated than they need to be. I know, but I was wrong about what I said, about who you were. He said it with the discomfort of a man who did not say these words often and had not rehearsed them adequately. I'm saying that. She looked at him for a long moment. The anger she'd been carrying since last week, the cold, careful anger she'd packed down and kept out of her face, shifted slightly. Not gone, but changed. You could still be wrong, she said. You're going by what one woman told your friend. That's secondhand in the other direction. He almost looked surprised. You're arguing against yourself. I'm telling you not to build a new version of me on somebody else's testimony either. She crossed her arms. I'm just a person. I made mistakes in my life. The thing in Laramie wasn't my mistake, but I've made others. She met his eyes. That's all I've got. Wade looked at her for a long, assessing moment. You're nothing like I expected, he said. No, she said. I don't imagine I am. He put his hat back on. Silas should know. About Prescott. About what Ruth said. Maybe. Not maybe. He should know who's in his house. He headed for the door, then stopped. He's not going to ask you to explain yourself. That's not how he is. But he'd want to know. I know how he is, Evelyn said quietly. Wade paused with his hand on the doorframe. He looked back at her one more time, and whatever he was looking for, or whatever he found, he nodded. A different nod than last time, something less armored in it. I'll be back when he's home, he said. I'd like to talk to him. He'll be in before dark. Wade left. This time his horse moved out at a walk rather than a retreat, and she watched him go from the kitchen window and felt the shape of something change. Not resolve, not settle, but shift into a new configuration she didn't have a name for yet. Claire appeared in the kitchen doorway behind her. Was that Uncle Wade? Yes. What did he want? Evelyn turned away from the window. To talk, she said. Claire looked at the door, then at her. Is he still going to make you leave? I don't think so. She looked at the girl, the dark eyes, the watchful face, the careful interior life of a child who had been managing too much for too long. Does that matter to you? Clara looked at her steadily. Rosie would cry, she said. I know. I would too, Claire said. She said it flatly, like a piece of information being conveyed rather than an admission being made. Probably. I haven't decided. Evelyn almost laughed. She felt it come up and swallowed it because she wasn't sure Clara was being funny and didn't want to get it wrong. I'm not leaving, she said. Not right now. Clara nodded once, with the brisk efficiency of someone filing a document. Then she went back to whatever she'd been doing, and Evelyn stood alone in the kitchen, and outside the window the Wyoming sky was the hard, brilliant blue of a November afternoon that had no idea what was coming. She thought about what Mabel Harding had said, about the woodpile, about winter. She went out to the yard and picked up the axe. She had work to do. The woodpile Evelyn built over the following 2 weeks was, by any reasonable measure, excessive. She knew it was excessive. Silas told her it was excessive, standing in the yard one afternoon counting the rows with the expression of a man who had come outside expecting to find a modest stack and had instead found something approaching a fortification. She'd split and stacked enough wood to carry them through February without breaking a sweat, and she was working on what would carry them through March. Mabel Harding said double it, Evelyn said, not stopping. Mabel Harding says that every year. Has she been wrong? He didn't answer that, which was its own kind of answer. He picked up the second axe and started splitting beside her without being asked, and they worked through the better part of an afternoon without talking much, falling into the rhythm of it, the way you fell into the rhythm of shared work when you'd been doing it long enough that the coordination happened without negotiation. That was something she'd noticed about Silas gradually, over the weeks. He was good at parallel work. He didn't need to talk through what they were doing or explain his reasoning or check in about whether things were going correctly. He just worked alongside and the work got done, and there was something in that she found easier than she expected. She'd spent enough time around people who needed conversation to fill every silence that a man who was comfortable letting the work be the conversation was a relief she hadn't anticipated. Wade had come back that evening and talked to Silas for a long time on the porch, while Evelyn put the girls to bed. She didn't try to hear what was said. She could have, probably, if she'd positioned herself by the front window, but she didn't. Whatever Silas needed to hear from his brother, he needed to hear it without her in the room. And whatever he decided after hearing it was his to decide without her standing there waiting for the verdict. He came inside after Wade left and stood in the kitchen for a moment, and she was at the table going over the household accounts. And she looked up, and he looked at her, and he said, "You all right?" "I'm fine," she said. "Are you?" "I'm working on it," he said, which was the most honest thing she'd ever heard a man say about his own state of being, and she went back to the accounts, and he went upstairs. And that was the entirety of that conversation. But he didn't ask her to leave, and in the morning he was at the stove before she was, which had never happened before. And when she came downstairs, he handed her a cup of coffee with the directness of a man who had settled something in himself overnight and was moving forward. She took the coffee. They didn't discuss it further. November deepened and the temperature dropped in the serious way that meant business rather than weather, the kind of cold that settled into the ground and stayed. The sky changed color, not dramatically, but in the way that people who lived under big sky learned to read, the color shifting from the clean, hard blue of autumn toward something grayer and more loaded. The light changed too, that flat, white-edged quality that pressed down from the north and made midday look like late afternoon. Evelyn watched the sky. She watched it the way Mabel had talked about reading it, and what she saw made her go back to the pantry and take inventory with a more serious eye than before. They had enough. The cornmeal, the dried beans, the salt pork, the jars she'd put up from the last of the fall vegetables. Enough for 2 weeks, maybe 3 if they were careful. She added rice to the list and more lamp oil and another tin of baking powder, and the next time Silas went to town, she sent the list with him. "That's a lot of oil," he said, looking at it. "Buy it anyway," she said. He bought it. Clara caught her at the window one evening, standing in the dark looking north. "You keep looking at the sky like that," the girl said. "There's weather coming." "How bad?" Evelyn looked at the flat white line sitting on the horizon, the way the stars were obscured at the edges, even though the sky overhead was clear. Bad enough. Clara came to stand beside her and looked at the sky too, with the focused, serious attention she brought to most things. Mama used to do that, she said. Look at the sky. She always knew. Did she? Papa says she was better at reading the land than anyone he'd ever known. Clara was quiet for a moment. He doesn't say that much anymore. About her, he used to say it more. Evelyn kept her eyes on the horizon. He will again, she said. Just takes time. How long? I don't know. Different for everyone. She glanced down at Clara. Are you asking because you're worried about him or because you miss hearing him talk about her? Clara was quiet for long enough that Evelyn thought she might not answer. Then she said, Both, I think. She looked at the window rather than through it. Is that bad? No, Evelyn said. That's just honest. Dad. The blizzard came on a Wednesday. It didn't announce itself with drama, which was the worst kind. The storms that came in loud and fast at least gave you time to know what was happening. This one came in quiet, the sky whitening over the course of an afternoon until you looked up and realized you could no longer see the tree line on the north ridge. And then the wind arrived, and by the time the wind arrived, the snow was already coming in horizontal sheets that hit the house like something with intent. Evelyn had seen it coming in the afternoon. Had felt it, more accurately, in the pressure of the air and the way the horses were uneasy in the barn and the quality of the silence that came before the wind. She'd brought in extra firewood, had filled every container in the kitchen with water from the pump, had gotten the oil lamps trimmed and ready, had moved extra blankets from the chest in the hall to the rooms where the girls slept. She'd done all of this without particularly saying why, just moving through the house with the focused efficiency of someone who had done storm preparations before, and knew that the difference between being ready and not ready was the 6 hours before it hit. When the wind came, Silas was still outside. He'd been in the barn, she thought. She'd heard him out there in the late afternoon. She was in the kitchen with Rosie on her hip when the sound of the storm went from far away to present, and she went to the window and found that she could barely see the barn through the white. She put Rosie in her chair and went to the door and opened it. The wind hit her like a wall. It was not cold in the way that November had been cold. It was cold in a different register entirely, the kind that was not about temperature on a scale, but about the basic hostility of moving air at speed. She held the door with both hands. Silas! She shouted it into the white and heard nothing back. Silas! A shape appeared from the direction of the barn. She could barely make it out at first, just a dark mass against the white. Then it resolved into him, one arm up against the wind, moving at a sideways angle because walking straight against it wasn't possible. He came through the door, and she pulled it shut behind him with both arms, and the wind resisted and then gave. He stood in the entryway covered in snow, breathing hard. His coat was already iced at the shoulders, and his face had gone that alarming pale gray that cold did to exposed skin when it was working fast. You all right? She said. Yeah. He was working on getting his breath back. The horses are in. I tied the barn door. Come in by the fire. He did. She got his coat off. It was stiff, the fabric rigid with ice at the seams, and got him into the chair closest to the fireplace with a blanket. And she didn't say anything about the fact that his hands were shaking when she handed him the coffee because pointing it out wouldn't help. Clara came downstairs, saw her father, and came to the other chair and sat down close without being asked. Just proximity. Just presence. Evelyn looked at the girl, and the girl looked back, and a small nod passed between them. Not conscious, not planned, just the wordless acknowledgement that passed between people who had been paying attention to the same thing. The storm settled in over the house like something claiming territory. Outside, the wind worked at every joint and gap in the structure, and the house talked back in its own language. The creak of the roof, the rattle of the window in the north bedroom, the way the fireplace drew slightly different as the pressure shifted. It was not a comfortable sound. It was the sound of a building doing the job it was built to do while being tested more seriously than usual and doing it adequately, but not with ease. They ate supper by the fire because the kitchen was colder than the sitting room, and there was no reason to be cold when there was a choice. Evelyn had made a thick soup from the salt pork and dried beans, the kind of thing that improved with a full day on the stove and got better the longer you let it alone. And they ate in the mixed light of the fire and 2 oil lamps with the storm pressing at the walls and Rosie falling asleep in Evelyn's lap over her bowl. How long? Claire asked. She was looking at the window at the snow building on the outside ledge. I don't know, Silas said. Could be a day, could be 3. Clara looked at Evelyn. The pantry is full, Evelyn said. The wood is stacked. The horses are in. She adjusted Rosie's weight against her side. We wait. Clara seemed to accept this, because waiting with a plan was different from waiting without one, and she was old enough to know the difference. Silas took Rosie to bed. Evelyn stayed by the fire to bank it properly for the night, a skill that seemed small but mattered more than almost anything else in a house in winter. Getting the fire banked right so it held through the cold hours without going out and without burning too fast. She adjusted the damper and laid the logs and covered the coals and stood up and turned around and found Silas in the doorway. I'll do the morning check, he said. You don't have to. I know. I mean it. The barn is going to be ugly getting to in the morning. I don't need you out in that. She looked at him. All right, she said, which was easier than arguing when he'd already made up his mind. He went upstairs. She stood alone in the sitting room with the banked fire and the storm noise and the particular quiet of a house full of sleeping people, and she went through the list in her head the way she'd been going through it all evening. Water, wood, food, lamp oil, medicine chest. Everything checked. Everything where it needed to be. She went to bed. She woke at 2 in the morning and knew immediately that something was wrong. She couldn't have said how she knew. There was no sound that was different from what the storm had been doing all night. But she was awake before she understood why, and she was on her feet before she finished understanding it, and she was in the hall before she'd made any conscious decision to get up. Rosie's door was open. She went in. The baby was awake. That was the first thing, the wrong thing. Rosie slept through most nights now, had been sleeping through since the fever weeks ago, and the middle of the night waking was unusual enough to register. But it was more than waking. She was restless in a particular way, moving her head back and forth against the mattress. And when Evelyn put her hand on her forehead, she felt it immediately. The fever. Not as bad as the last time. Not yet. But real and rising, and in a baby who had just come through a serious illness the month before. Even a moderate fever was not something to take lightly. She picked Rosie up. The baby made a sound against her shoulder. Not crying, not the wail she'd had last time, but the hot, uncomfortable complaint of a child whose body was doing something she didn't like. I know, Evelyn said. I know, sweetheart. She went to Clara's room and put her hand on the girl's shoulder. Clara woke instantly. The light sleeper's reflex, the child who had trained herself to come awake fast because fast mattered. Rosie, Clara said. She was already sitting up. Fever, I need you up and dressed. Clara was dressed by the time Evelyn had the lamp lit. They went through what Evelyn knew to do, which was the same thing she'd done the last time. Cool cloths, water, keeping the baby upright when the fever made her want to curl in. She'd gotten better at it since September, which was not a thing she'd expected to get better at, and was not particularly glad about. But here they were. How bad? Clara asked. She was holding the water basin while Evelyn wrung the cloth. Bad enough. Like before? Not yet. I want to keep it that way. She pressed the cloth to the back of Rosie's neck. Go wake your father. Clara went. She heard Silas come awake, the quick, disoriented sound of someone moving from sleep to standing faster than the transition should allow. And then his steps in the hall, and then he was in the doorway, his shirt half tucked, his hair showing where he'd been sleeping on it. He looked at Rosie and his face went through 3 things in rapid succession. Fear, the forcing down of fear, and then the particular focused stillness that was his version of keeping it together. How long has she been like this? He said. I found her maybe 10 minutes ago. She was already warm then. Evelyn looked at him steadily. It's not where it was last time, but the medicine we have isn't enough. If it climbs, she didn't finish that. She didn't need to. He knew what it meant. He looked at the window where the storm was still going. Ishwom. She could hear it in the walls, in the pressure of it, and she could see the snow banked on the outside ledge up past the bottom pane. The doctor's in Grover Falls, he said. 20 miles. In this. He was looking at the window, not at her. His jaw was tight. She could see him running the calculation the way you ran calculations that didn't have good answers. Cost on one side, cost on the other, choose the one that was less impossible. I can manage her through the night, Evelyn said. I've done it before. But if the fever goes higher than last time, she held his eyes. Silas, if it goes higher, she needs more than what I can do. He looked at Rosie. The baby had her eyes half open, glassy, the hot flush of fever up her cheeks and across her small forehead, and she had her fist curled against Evelyn's collar the way she always did when she was distressed. Evelyn watched him make the decision. She could see it happen. "I'm going," he said. "I know." She'd known since she'd woken the moment she'd felt the fever under her hand. "Take the gray. He's better in the snow than the bay. And take everything. I'll be back as fast as—" "Don't be fast," she said. "Be safe. Clara and I will manage here. You just make it there and make it back." He looked at her for a moment. His eyes had something in them that she didn't look at too directly. "Keep her alive," he said. "I intend to," Evelyn said. "Go." The sound of his horse leaving was swallowed by the storm within seconds. She stood at the window for a moment after it was gone, just to be sure, as if looking at the white dark would show her something useful. It didn't. She turned back to the room. Clara was sitting on the floor beside the crib with her legs crossed and her back straight, holding the water basin in her lap. "What do we do now?" she asked. "We do what we're doing," Evelyn said, "and we don't stop." What they were doing was managing the fever with the tools they had, which were limited but not nothing. Cool water and cloths to draw the heat out of the skin, small amounts of water to keep Rosie from getting dry on the inside while the fever burned, keeping her upright enough to breathe easily, keeping the room warm enough that the contrast between the baby's heat and the air temperature didn't shock her system. Evelyn knew the basics of fever management the way she knew the basics of most things, imperfectly, practically, with a knowledge that came from necessity rather than training. She'd nursed her younger brother through scarlet fever when she was 16, and their mother had been down with it herself. She'd managed a boarding house full of sick men through a winter flu outbreak. She dealt with sick children and sick adults and horses with respiratory infections, and a dog that had eaten something it shouldn't have. And none of that was medical training, but all of it had taught her the fundamental thing. You watched, and you responded, and you did not panic, because panic was the one thing you could guarantee would not help. She talked to Rosie, not in the soft, meaningless way people talk to infants when they were nervous, filling silence with noise. She talked to her the way she'd been talking to her since September, in the same even voice she used for everything. She talked about the storm outside. She talked about the gray horse and how far he could go in a night. She talked about spring, which was months away but was coming regardless, and about the chickens, who had opinions about everything, and about the way the Northfield looked in the early morning when the frost was still on it. Rosie didn't understand the words. Evelyn knew that. But she understood the voice, and the voice said, "I'm here. I'm not afraid. Nothing has gone wrong that can't be managed." That was the only lie in the whole of it, because she was afraid. She was afraid in the careful, controlled way she'd gotten good at. The fear tucked behind the function, the hand still steady on the cloth, while the fear did what it needed to do in the back of her chest. Clara tracked the fever. That was Evelyn's idea, and Clara took to it with the focused attention she brought to everything. Every half hour she put her palm to Rosie's forehead and reported what she felt, and Evelyn used that information to judge whether the cloths needed changing faster or whether they were holding it. "Same," Clara said at 2:30. "Same," at 3. Maybe a little worse at 3:30, and Evelyn felt the spike of fear cut sharper and forced it back down and changed the cloths faster. "Same," at 4. At 4:15, Rosie cried. Actually cried, not the glassy, weak sound of before, but real crying, the full-throated protest of a baby who was uncomfortable and unhappy and very much alive. Clara looked up. "Is that good?" she asked. "That's good," Evelyn said, and she meant it. "That means she's fighting." She held the baby and let her cry and felt something in her own chest unknot incrementally, because crying like that took energy, and a baby with no energy didn't cry. "You're stubborn," she told Rosie. "Good. You come by it honestly." Clara, sitting against the wall, said, "She gets it from Papa." Evelyn looked at her. Clara almost smiled, a small, tired, real smile, the kind that came out when you were too exhausted to manage your face properly. "She might get it from both sides," Evelyn said. The hours between 4 and dawn were the worst kind. The hours where the will to stay awake and stay present had to come from somewhere other than energy, because the energy was gone, and what was left was just the decision. Evelyn stayed awake. Clara fell asleep around 5 against the wall, her head tipped sideways, the water basin still in her lap, and Evelyn left her there because sleep was what a child needed, and the basin wasn't going anywhere. She sat in the rocking chair with Rosie against her shoulder, and the lamp turned low and the storm going outside the walls, and she breathed in time with the baby's breathing because it kept her focused on the right thing. The fever peaked somewhere around 5:30, and then, gradually, incrementally, in the 2 steps forward, 1 step back way that fevers moved when they were beginning to lose, it started to come down. She felt it in the quality of the skin under her hand, felt it in the way Rosie's breathing changed from the shallow, effortful breathing of a body working too hard to something with a little more ease in it. Felt it in the small fists that had been clenched against her collar, slowly, slowly releasing. She didn't say anything. She didn't move. She sat in the chair and held the baby and listened to the storm and waited. The gray came back into the yard at 7:30 in the morning. Evelyn heard the hooves first, the sound carrying differently now, because the storm had broken in the pre-dawn hours, the wind dying suddenly the way wind sometimes did, as if it had simply lost interest. The snow had stopped. The world outside the windows was the terrible, brilliant white of aftermath, the kind of brightness that hurt to look at, flat and total in every direction. She was still in the chair with Rosie when she heard the horse. She stood carefully, transferring the baby to the crib without waking her, and went to the window and looked out. He was crossing the yard and he was not moving right. She saw it immediately, the way he was leaning forward over the gray's neck, not in the posture of a rider, but in the posture of a man holding on. The horse was moving carefully, picking its way through the drifts, and Silas was on his back, but barely. Even at this distance and through the bright morning light, she could see that something was wrong. She got her coat and was through the door before she'd finished putting it on. The cold hit her like a physical object, the post-storm cold that was worse than storm cold, the still air doing nothing to soften the temperature. She crossed the yard through knee-high drifts, punching through the crust with every step, and she got to the horse as Silas was trying to get down and not managing it cleanly. She got under his arm. He was ice. Not in the way she'd seen him come in from the storm the first night, which had been cold and had made him pale and had made his hands shake. This was different. His coat was rigid. His face was a color she'd only seen once before, on a man she'd found in a ditch in January 3 years ago. And that man had been alive, but barely, and the color was the color of a body that had redirected all its resources to keeping the core going and had been doing it for too long. "I've got you," she said. "Can you walk?" "Yeah." It came out thick, his jaw not cooperating properly with the word. "All right, come on." She got him inside. She didn't ask questions. She got his coat off, which was worse than the last time, stiff all the way through, and got him into the chair by the fire, and got the fire built up fast, not banked for conservation, but burning hard for heat. She pulled every blanket from the chest in the corner, and she got them around him, and she put water on for coffee, and she did not let herself look at his color again because looking at it used up energy she needed for other things. "The doctor," she said, "coming?" He said it with his eyes closed, his head back against the chair. "He's coming behind me. Slower. He's got the buckboard, but he's coming." "All right." She pressed the back of her hand to his. The skin was cold in a way that said the damage was real, not just discomfort. "Silas, can you feel your feet?" A pause. "Some." "Your hands?" "Some." He opened his eyes. They were clear at least. The clearness was a relief. The worst thing she'd feared was confusion, and there wasn't any. Just cold and exhaustion stripped down to the bone. "Rosie?" "Fever broke about an hour ago," Evelyn said. "She's sleeping." He closed his eyes again. She watched his chest rise and fall. "The road back," he said. "The drift on the east cutoff. The horse almost went down." A pause. "I almost went down." She kept her face even. "But you didn't." "No." He was quiet for a moment. "I kept thinking, if I don't make it back, there's nobody." He said it without self-pity, flatly, the way he said most things. "Just you. And I thought, she'll keep Rosie alive. That's the kind of thing you—" "I thought that." Evelyn said nothing. She wrapped the blanket tighter around his shoulders and went to check the water. "You did," he said to her back. "Didn't you?" "She's sleeping," Evelyn said. "Fever's down." "Yes." She heard him exhale, the long, slow exhale of a man releasing something he'd been carrying for 20 miles in a blizzard. The sound of it moved through her in a way she didn't try to name. Clara appeared in the kitchen doorway with Rosie on her hip, the baby awake now, blinking in the bright morning light coming through the window, looking slightly confused about the world, but fundamentally herself again. Silas looked at his daughters. He looked at them the way a man looked at things he'd ridden through ice and dark and wind to get back to, and there was nothing complicated in his face right then, just the plain, unguarded truth of it. Clara carried Rosie over and sat on the arm of the chair, and Silas put his cold hand on the baby's back and closed his eyes. The doctor arrived 2 hours later with his buckboard and his black bag, stamping snow off his boots in the entryway and looking at the assembled household with the efficient assessment of a man who had seen a great many frontier emergencies and had learned to triage on arrival. He checked Rosie first, listened to her chest, checked her color, took her temperature with the thermometer he produced from his bag, with the care of someone who understood that instruments like this didn't grow on trees out here. "Croup," he said, "starting. Another day without treatment, and it would have been considerably worse." He looked at Evelyn. "You kept the fever managed." "We did what we could." "You did more than most." He repacked the thermometer. "She'll need this." He produced a small paper packet. "And steam. Get the kettle going in a closed room twice a day for a week. She'll be fine." He turned to Silas next and had considerably more to say about the state of his hands and feet. None of it pleasant, but the conclusion of it was that there was no permanent damage. The tissue was cold damaged, but not past recovery, and with warmth and time he would be fully functional. He said this with the brisk lack of sentiment of a man who had delivered worse news often enough that good news was simply the absence of catastrophe. "Keep him warm," he told Evelyn. "Keep the hands out of cold water for 2 weeks. He'll try to ignore that." He looked at Silas directly. "Don't." "All right," Silas said. The doctor looked at Evelyn with the slightly appraising look of someone reassessing a situation. "You a nurse?" "No." "You do nursing." "I do what needs doing." He looked around the kitchen, the organized pantry, the stacked wood visible through the window, the lamp oil lined up on the shelf, the steam already building on the kettle she'd put on without being told. Something moved in his expression. "The ranch was yours to manage last night," he said. It was not quite a question. It was. He snapped his bag shut. Then it was in reasonable hands. He accepted the coffee she poured him and drank it standing, and he left 30 minutes later with payment from Silas and the piece of Evelyn's cornbread she'd pressed on him for the road, and the buckboard moved out of the yard and the ranch was quiet again. The 4 of them, Silas in the chair, Clara on the arm of it with Rosie in her lap, Evelyn across the room, sat in the white winter light that was coming through every window now, the storm entirely past, the world outside bright and still and brutally cold. Rosie reached for Evelyn. She reached the way she always reached, both arms out, the full frank demand of her, not a request, but a statement of what she needed. Evelyn came across the room and picked her up, and the baby settled against her shoulder and grabbed her collar. Silas was watching. She could feel it. She looked up and met his eyes, and what was in his face was not the careful distance he'd kept for 6 weeks, or the grief that lived just underneath everything, or the wariness of a man still deciding how much to trust. It was something simpler than all of that, and plainer, and it was the look of a man who had understood something during the ride home that he'd only been approaching before. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. Clara looked at her father, and looked at Evelyn, and looked at Rosie asleep against Evelyn's neck, and she said, with the quiet certainty of a child who had been watching carefully for a very long time, "She stayed." "She stayed," Silas said. Outside the windows, the sun was working on the snow, still too cold to melt it, but bright enough to make it hurt to look at. The kind of morning that came after the worst nights, indifferent to what had been survived, just going on regardless. The ranch sat in the middle of all that white, and the house held the heat it had been holding all night, and the fire in the sitting room settled into coals, and the family inside it was all present and accounted for. That was enough. That was, for this particular morning, more than enough. The recovery was not clean or swift, because nothing on the frontier ever was. Silas's hands healed slowly, the way cold damaged tissue healed. Not in a straight line from damage to whole, but in the irregular, frustrating way of something that got better, and then worse, and then better again by degrees too small to track on any given day. He woke the morning after the storm with his fingers swollen to a degree that made ordinary grip impossible. And he woke the morning after that to find the swelling down but the skin cracked and tender at the knuckles. And he woke the morning after that to discover he'd managed to forget the doctor's instruction about cold water when he went to break the ice on the water trough before Evelyn was up. She found him at the basin with both hands submerged and said nothing for a moment. "The doctor said 2 weeks," she said. "It was just ice." "I know what it was." He looked at his hands in the water. He had the expression of a man who had made a mistake he knew was a mistake while he was making it, but had made it anyway, which was an expression Evelyn was beginning to recognize as a fairly reliable feature of his face when work and common sense were in direct conflict. She brought him a towel without further comment and went to start breakfast, and he dried his hands with the careful, slightly sheepish efficiency of someone who had received exactly the amount of response he deserved and was grateful it hadn't been more. The balance of the ranch fell to her for those 2 weeks in a way it hadn't fully fallen before. She'd been doing the household work since September, the cooking and cleaning and child management and the gradual, patient organization of a space that had been running on fumes. But the outdoor work had been his, the animals, the fences, the maintenance of the things that kept the ranch functional as a working property rather than just a dwelling. With his hands out of commission for anything requiring real grip, the split became more complete. She didn't mind it. That was the honest answer, and she turned it over a few times looking for the dishonesty in it and didn't find any. The work was real, and she was good at it, and there was a satisfaction in that which she'd missed without quite knowing she'd been missing it. The satisfaction of seeing a thing that needed doing and doing it and having it be done. She brought in the horses each morning. She managed the feed, rationing the hay carefully because the storm had compressed the timeline on what they'd need to get through to spring. She cleared the paths between the house and the barn and the outhouse and the woodpile with a methodical patience that became its own kind of meditation, the shovel and the cold air and the white quiet of the aftermath, and nothing required of her except to keep moving. Wade came by on the 5th day after the storm, on a gray horse that was picking its way through the remaining drifts with the dignified skepticism of an animal that had opinions about Wyoming winters. He came in and sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and talked to Silas about the state of the roads and the condition of his own property after the storm and the fact that 2 of his cattle had gotten out through a fence line. The storm had taken down and had been recovered, but one was lame and probably wouldn't recover useful. Evelyn was at the stove and she stayed at the stove and said nothing unless addressed, which was what she did when Wade was in the house. Not because she was uncomfortable with him anymore exactly, but because the dynamic between the 2 brothers was something she felt she didn't entirely understand yet, and she preferred to let it exist without her weight in it. Wade addressed her on his way out. "You get the path to the barn clear?" he asked. 2 days ago." "Animal losses?" "None." He nodded. He had his hat in his hand, the gesture she'd noticed before. The hat in hand as opposed to hat on, the one that she'd decided was his version of acknowledging something he found uncomfortable to acknowledge. "You did good," he said. "In the storm." She looked at him steadily. "We all did what needed doing. Silas told me what shape he was in when he got back." He said it looking at the doorway rather than at her, which was as close to difficulty as she'd seen him express directly. "And what shape Rosie was in when he left." He paused. "He wasn't wrong to go. The baby needed a doctor, but he also left 2 children and a woman he'd known for 6 weeks alone in a blizzard that—" He stopped. "That could have gone a different way." "But it didn't," Evelyn said. "No." He looked at her then. "It didn't." He left and she stood at the kitchen window and watched him ride out, and she thought about what he'd almost said, which was that Silas had trusted her with the most important things he had, and that the trust had not been misplaced, and that this fact was causing Wade Boone to recalculate something he'd been certain about. She thought about that for a while. Then she went back to work because thinking about it more than briefly wasn't going to accomplish anything useful. Silas started talking more. It happened the way most things between them happened, gradually, without announcement, as a shift in the existing pattern rather than the introduction of a new one. He'd always answered questions. He'd always said what needed saying about the ranch, about the girls, about practical things requiring coordination. But after the storm, he started saying things that weren't strictly practical, in the unguarded moments between practical things. He told her about the road to Grover Falls. He told her about it one evening when the girls were asleep and the kitchen was cleaned and they were both still at the table because neither of them had moved toward the stairs yet. He told her about the east cutoff and the drift that had been up to the gray's chest, and the way the horse had trusted him through it when any other animal would have balked, and the way the wind had been so absolute that he'd navigated by memory rather than sight for the last 4 miles because there was nothing to see. I knew where I was, he said. I've ridden that road enough times that I knew it in the dark, but it didn't feel like knowing. It felt like guessing and hoping the guess was right. Was it? It was. He turned his coffee cup on the table. Barely. You made it. I know. He was quiet for a moment. I thought about Rosie the whole way. What it meant if I didn't make it. What would happen to Clara? He stopped. And then I thought about you. The kitchen was quiet. I thought, she'll hold the line, he said. She won't let them down. He looked at her. That was the thing that made the rest of it, I don't know, bearable. Knowing that whatever happened to me on that road, you were going to hold the line. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. That's a lot to put on someone you've known for 6 weeks, she said. Yeah. He didn't look away. I know that. She looked at the table. I would have, she said. I did. I know. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It had stopped being uncomfortable some time ago. She wasn't sure exactly when, whether it was before the storm or during it or in the white quiet of the morning after, when she'd looked up and found him watching her with Rosie on her shoulder. The silence had just changed, and she'd noticed the change without being able to pinpoint the moment. Can I ask you something? He said. You can ask. Why did you stay? He said it carefully, not as accusation. At the gate that first time. And then when Wade came. You had every reason to leave. Better reasons than most people would have needed. She thought about how to answer that. She'd been turning the question over in her own mind for weeks, in the quiet hours, in the mornings before anyone else was up, in the repetitive physical work that left enough of her head free to keep turning things over. I'm not completely sure, she said honestly. Part of it was Rosie and Clara. She paused. Part of it was that I'd been moving for almost a year and I was so tired of moving that staying felt like the only thing I had the energy left to do. She looked at him. And part of it was that this felt like a place that was worth the trouble. He held her gaze. Even with Wade. Even with Wade. He nodded slowly. Then he said, Wade told me the rest. About Prescott. About what the woman on his staff said. Evelyn kept her face still. I didn't ask him to dig into it, Silas said. But he did, and he told me. He turned the cup again. I want you to know it doesn't change how I've seen you since the first week. Whatever happened in Laramie, I know what I've seen here. Those things don't contradict each other. They might, she said carefully. Depending on what you heard. They don't. He said it without room for argument, not dismissive, just certain, the way he was certain about things he'd decided and wasn't going to undecide. You don't have to explain it to me. I'm not asking you to. She looked at him for a long moment. Most people want the explanation. Most people want something to make sense of the story they already have, he said. I'm not interested in the story somebody else decided about you. She felt something move in her chest. Not a dramatic thing, not a flood or a release, just a quiet shift, like a weight she'd been carrying in one hand being set down. Not gone, just set down for a moment. You're a strange man, Silas Boone, she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. I've been told. She got up and brought the coffee pot from the stove and refilled both cups because it was something to do with her hands, and she needed something to do with her hands right then. She sat back down and wrapped both palms around the cup and looked at the window, where the night was clear and cold and enormous. His name was Edmund Prescott, she said. He was a businessman. Land speculation mostly. He had a wife and 2 children and a nice house on the east side of Laramie, and he sat on the town council. She said it evenly, without heat. I worked as a housekeeper for a family 2 doors down from his. Not for him. Never for him. I knew him the way you knew prominent people in a town, enough to recognize the face. Silas said nothing. He was watching her. He took an interest, she said. I made clear I didn't share it. He didn't find that acceptable. She paused. The specific thing he did, it doesn't matter the details. What mattered was that afterward he needed an explanation that didn't reflect on him. and I was available to be the explanation. He lied to his wife. He lied to everyone, his wife, his friends, the people on the council. He told a story it was a good story. It had everything a story like that needs. A man who'd been foolish but was ultimately innocent, and a woman who had done the pursuing and been told no and had reacted badly. She looked at the table. He'd had practice, I think. Ruth, Wade's friend's contact, she said I wasn't the first. He'd done a version of it before. With the same result? I don't know what happened to the one before me. She said it plainly. I know what happened to me. And you ran. I left, she said. The distinction mattered to her. I left because staying was going to be worse than going, because no one was going to believe me over him, and every day I stayed was another day of being that story, of being looked at like I was that story. She stopped. I thought if I got far enough from Laramie, I'd get past it. It's bigger than I expected. Frontier isn't as big as it looks from outside it, Silas said. Things travel. Yes, she said. I found that out. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Prescott's still in Laramie? I assume so. She looked at him. Don't. I'm not planning anything, he said. I just think a man like that should be answered for eventually. Eventually is a long way off, Evelyn said, and I can't get to eventually if I'm still stuck in then. She looked at her coffee. I don't want him taking up more space than he already has. Silas accepted this the way he accepted most things she said, not always agreeing, she could tell, but respecting the fact that she'd thought it through and arrived somewhere for reasons. All right, he said. All right, she said. They sat for a while longer in the quiet kitchen, and the night pressed at the windows, and the house settled around them in the ordinary way of houses in winter, and nothing in that moment was resolved or finished or neat. She was still a woman with a damaged name living in a dead woman's house. He was still a widower with 2 daughters and cold damaged hands and more grief than he'd processed. None of that had changed, but something had. The town of Hadley Crossing was 12 miles from the ranch, and Evelyn had not been to it once in the 2 months she'd been at Iron Ridge. She'd had no reason to go and several reasons not to. She knew how she was being talked about in whatever version of the story had reached it, and she had no particular desire to walk into a general store and feel the temperature change. Silas had made the town trips. She'd given him the lists and he'd bought what was on them and brought it back, and that arrangement had suited her fine. It stopped suiting her the morning Silas's hands were finally recovered enough for real work, and he came inside from the barn saying that the fence on the south pasture had been pulled down by snow weight overnight, and he needed lumber from the hardware in Hadley Crossing, and he needed it today. I'll go, she said. He looked at her. You need to be here for the fence assessment, she said practically. I know the list, I know the wagon, and my hands aren't damaged. Evelyn, I'm not afraid of going to town, she said, which was not entirely true, but it was true enough. I'll take Clara. Clara looked up from the corner where she'd been reading with Rosie in her lap, with the alert attention of someone who had heard her name and was rapidly assessing the implications. I'd like to go, Clara said. I need thread. Silas looked at his younger daughter. He looked at Evelyn. He had the expression of a man who had run out of practical objections and was aware that running out of practical objections meant the conversation was over. All right, he said. Take the gray. The road to Hadley Crossing was quiet and cold and beautiful in the particular way of a Wyoming winter that had delivered its worst and was now simply being winter. The sky a hard, brilliant blue, the snowfields on either side of the road crusted over and glittering, the air sharp enough that breathing it felt like drinking something very cold. Clara sat on the seat beside Evelyn with her coat buttoned to the chin and her hat pulled low and talked steadily about a book she was reading, which was her way of managing the anticipatory excitement of going to town. Evelyn listened and drove and let the cold air do what cold air did to her head, which was clarify things that tended to blur indoors. She had been at Iron Ridge for 2 months. That was the number she kept returning to, 2 months. And in that time she had not moved from the place where she'd stopped to drink water from a pump. 2 months was longer than she'd stayed anywhere since Laramie. It was longer than she'd stayed anywhere voluntarily in almost 2 years. She thought about what it meant to stop moving. She'd been telling herself it was temporary since the first week. Temporary, provisional, contingent on some external condition that would eventually present itself and require her to reassess. But the condition kept not presenting itself. The days kept being reasons to stay rather than reasons to go. And the reasons kept accumulating. And at some point, the accumulation of reasons became its own kind of answer to the question she'd been refusing to ask directly. Hadley Crossing announced itself with a church steeple and a water tower and the smell of wood smoke over everything. It was a small town. Smaller than Laramie, smaller than most of the towns she'd passed through on her year of moving, with a main street that ran 4 blocks and a collection of the buildings any frontier town required. The hardware, the general store, the bank, the livery, the small hotel that doubled as the saloon after 6 in the evening. She pulled up at the hardware and helped Clara down from the wagon, and they went in together. The man behind the counter was somewhere in his 50s with the broad hands of someone who'd been handling hardware all his working life. He looked up when they came in, and she saw the recognition move across his face. Not of her specifically, she thought, but of the category. New woman. Unknown. Let me think about what I know about her. She met his eyes directly and said, I need lumber. 1/2-inch pine board and 2x4s for fence repair. You can put it on the Boone account. The man's expression shifted, the recognition rearranging itself. Boone? Silas Boone? Yes. I heard he'd taken someone on after the winter. He looked at her a moment longer, then moved toward the lumber, because whatever calculation he was running, the Boone account was a known entity, and the woman on behalf of it was apparently competent, which was enough to proceed on. She gave him the measurements Silas had written down, and he pulled what she needed, and she checked his count without making a production of it, because you checked counts, and that was that. He was watching her check, and something in his expression changed again. Smaller this time, harder to read. You were here through that blizzard last month? He said. Yes. Heard it was a bad one out that direction. It was. Baby's sick, I heard. She looked at him. The baby is fine. He held her gaze for a moment and then nodded once. Not warmly, not unfriendly. Just the acknowledgement of someone filing information into whatever ledger he maintained about people who passed through his hardware store. Clara, beside her, had been looking at the nails displayed on the wall with the focused interest of someone who found nails genuinely compelling. She turned now and looked at the man and said, with the perfect unself-conscious directness of a child who had not yet learned to soften things, Evelyn kept Rosie alive by herself all night in the storm. Papa rode 20 miles to get the doctor, and Evelyn kept Rosie alive the whole time he was gone. The man looked at the child. Is that right? He said. It is, Claire said. She knew what to do, and she didn't stop, and Rosie's fine. Evelyn put her hand briefly on Clara's shoulder. Not to stop her, she'd already said it, but the gesture of someone who didn't know quite what else to do with that specific kind of advocacy. The man behind the counter looked at Evelyn again, and this time the look was slightly different, still assessing, but the thing he was assessing had changed. Load that up for you, he said. Thank you, Evelyn said. They went to the general store after, and Clara got her thread and Evelyn got what was on the list, and the woman behind the counter there was cooler. Not hostile, but the specific temperature of someone who had decided things and wasn't going to let a transaction change them. Evelyn paid for the goods and thanked her and left, because that was all there was to do. In the wagon on the way home, Clara said, She didn't like you. No. Because of the stories. Evelyn looked at the road. Probably. That's not fair. No, Evelyn said. It isn't. Clara was quiet for a moment, and then she said, with the careful deliberateness of someone who had been thinking about something for a while and had decided to say it. Mama had a saying. She said the people who decide things fast decide them wrong more than half the time. She said the people worth knowing take their time. Evelyn didn't say anything for a moment. Your mother sounds like she was wise, she said. She was. Clara looked at the road. I think she would have liked you, she said. She liked people who knew how to work. A pause. And she liked people who didn't make a big fuss about being scared. She said the bravest people she knew were scared all the time. They just kept going anyway. Evelyn gripped the reins and looked at the open road ahead, and felt something move through her that was not sadness exactly, and not happiness exactly, but something in the neighborhood of both. I think I would have liked her too, she said. Wade arrived on a Saturday in mid-December, and this time he brought his wife. Evelyn hadn't known he was married, hadn't thought to ask, and he hadn't offered it. The woman who climbed down from the buckboard was small and composed, and somewhere in her early 40s, with light gray eyes and the look of someone who had made a number of assessments before she'd even finished getting her feet on the ground. Her name was Frances, and she shook Evelyn's hand when Wade introduced them with the firm, direct handshake of someone who considered handshakes a form of communication. "I've heard about you," Frances said. Not with warmth, not with coldness, just a statement. "From Wade," Evelyn said. "Some from Wade, some from other places." She looked at Evelyn with those gray eyes. "I like to make up my own mind." "That seems reasonable," Evelyn said. They went inside and Evelyn made coffee, and Frances sat at the kitchen table and watched how Evelyn moved through the space the way Evelyn had once watched how new boarding house tenants moved through a room. Learning things from observation the conversation wouldn't tell you. She watched how Rosie responded to Evelyn, which was immediately and with total confidence. She watched how Clara moved around her, the easy proximity of it, the absence of the careful distance that children kept around people they weren't sure of. She watched Silas. That was the most interesting watching, Evelyn thought, because Silas was not a demonstrative man, and he wasn't going to demonstrate anything with his brother in the room. But Frances Boone was watching for something subtler than demonstration. She was watching the way he oriented, the way his attention moved, the way he occupied the room differently when Evelyn was in it. What she found there, Evelyn couldn't have said, but she filed it away. After lunch, while Silas and Wade were outside looking at the south fence, Frances helped Evelyn wash the dishes. She did it without being asked, and she did it efficiently, and they worked in the side-by-side quiet for a while before Frances said, "He talks about you." "Wade?" "Silas." She dried a plate. "When Wade comes home from here, he tells me what Silas has said, and Silas talks about you more than he probably realizes." Evelyn kept her hands in the water. "I don't know what to do with that," she said honestly. "Neither does he," Frances said. "He's not a man who acts fast on things that matter. Takes him time to work up to a thing." She set the dry plate down. "But when he works up to it, he doesn't go back. That's how he is." Evelyn looked at the window. "Frances," she said carefully, "Wade had concerns, real ones, about what my past might bring to this family." "Wade has concerns about most things," Frances said. "He's a worrier dressed up as a skeptic." She said it without heat, the way you described someone's nature when you'd lived with it long enough to find it factual rather than frustrating. "He's also been wrong before. He's better than most at admitting it when he is." She looked at Evelyn. "He admitted it about you." "He told me." "Did he tell you what he actually said to me?" She picked up another plate. "He came home after that blizzard, and he sat down at our table and he said, 'Frances, I misjudged that woman badly, and I'm going to have to figure out how to say that to her face, and I think Silas is going to want to marry her, and I need to decide how I feel about that before it happens.'" Evelyn went still. "That's what he said," Frances said, without looking at her. 2 weeks ago, drying these exact same dishes in our kitchen. The water in the basin was going cold and Evelyn was not moving her hands in it. "Wade says things like that when he's already decided them," Frances said. "He doesn't speculate out loud about things he's not certain of. It's one of his qualities." She finished the plate. "I'm not telling you this to put pressure on anything. I'm telling you because you should know the landscape you're in." She glanced at Evelyn. "You seem like someone who navigates better with accurate information." Evelyn managed a breath. "I do," she said. "Good." Frances set the plate on the stack. "Now, tell me what you actually did during that blizzard because I've heard 3 different versions, and I want the one that's true." The conversation that changed things happened 3 days later. Not the conversation with Frances, though that had its own weight. Not the conversation with Silas in the kitchen over burned biscuits, or the one about Prescott, or the one about the road home from Grover Falls. Those had all been approaches to the thing, circles drawn around it, and they mattered. But the conversation that changed things was smaller than all of those, and it happened in the barn on a Tuesday afternoon when the light through the cracks in the boards was the flat pewter light of December, and neither of them had planned it. She'd gone out to check on the gray's foreleg, which had been tender again. The cold made old injuries complain, and this horse had a history in that leg she'd learned to watch. Silas was there already, doing something with the harness that his hands were recovered enough for, but only barely, and he was managing it with the careful attention of someone who was not going to admit that it was harder than it should have been. She did the leg check and straightened up, and he was still working at the harness, and she said, "Let me do that. I've got it. Your grip is still off on the right." "I said I've got it, Evelyn." She looked at him. He looked at her. The stubbornness in his face was the same stubbornness she'd learned to read, not the defensive kind that came from pride, but the kind that came from a man who had been unable to do things he needed to do and was not comfortable with that and was not yet entirely past it. "All right," she said. She leaned against the stall door and waited. He worked at the harness, and she watched the pewter light come through the boards and listened to the horses shift in their stalls and thought about nothing in particular, which was something she was getting better at. After a while, he said, without turning around, "I want to ask you something." "Ask? Are you staying?" She looked at his back. "Here," he said, "at Iron Ridge, past the winter." He was still not turning around. "I need to know if you're staying." She was quiet for a moment. "Why do you need to know?" she asked. He set down the harness. He turned around then, and his face had the open, unguarded quality that it got when he'd made a decision and was past the point of managing how he looked while he delivered it. "Because Clara's attached," he said. "Because Rosie's attached. Because if you're going to leave in the spring, I need to prepare them for that. I need to prepare myself for that." She held his eyes. "And because I don't want you to go," he said. It came out plainly, the way he said most important things. Without decoration, without the hedging that might have made it easier to hear but less true. "I'm not asking you for anything. I'm not putting anything on you. He stopped. "I need to know which direction you're pointed." The barn was very quiet. Outside, something moved in the cold air, a branch giving under snow weight, a small crack of sound. "I'm not pointed anywhere," Evelyn said. "That's the first time in 2 years I could say that and mean it." He waited. "I don't know what I'm doing," she said. "I don't know what any of this is. I know that I stopped wanting to leave some time ago, and I can't tell you exactly when that was. I know that your daughters are—" She stopped, started over. "I know that Clara reading to me in the evenings is something I didn't know I was going to care about, and I care about it. I know that Rosie reaching for me in the morning is—" She looked at the floor. "I know that matters. And me?" he said. Quiet, not pressing, just asking. She looked at him. "You matter," she said, simply, the way he said things. He nodded. He let out a slow breath, and his shoulders dropped a fraction. The release of something held for a while. He didn't cross the distance between them. He didn't reach for her hand. He was not a man who moved fast on things that mattered, and she was not a woman who trusted fast-moving things, and they both understood that without having to say it. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. She pushed off the stall door and came to the harness and looked at the buckle he'd been working on, and she saw immediately what the problem was. Not his hands, actually, but the leather had stiffened in the cold and needed working before the buckle would seat properly. She flexed it in her hands a few times and felt it give and slid the buckle into place. She handed it back to him. His fingers brushed hers when he took it. Neither of them said anything about that. She went back to the house, and she stood in the kitchen for a moment with her coat still on and the warmth of the room coming at her from all sides, and she listened to the sound of the house. Rosie's voice from upstairs, the particular babble of her afternoon energy, and Clara's lower responding murmur, and the creak of the old floors, and the stove doing its steady, reliable work in the corner. The house sounded like a house with people in it. She took off her coat and hung it on the peg that she'd started thinking of as hers without meaning to, the third peg from the door, the one that was the right height for her arm. She went to the stove to start supper, and the kitchen smelled like coffee and wood smoke and the dried herbs she'd hung in the fall, and outside the window the December light was going the way December light went, early, fast, pulling the color out of the sky in the particular sequence of a day ending in the middle of the afternoon and leaving the long winter dark to cover everything until morning. She stood at the stove and thought about what Silas had asked her. "Are you staying?" She reached for the pot and set it on the heat and answered the question, privately, in the quiet of the kitchen with no one else there to hear. "Yes," she thought, "I think I am." It was not a triumphant thought. It was not a relieved one. It was quieter than both of those. The specific quiet of a decision that had been building for 2 months and had finally found the surface. She didn't know what came next. She didn't know what it would look like or what it would cost, or whether the story that had been following her would eventually find her here and demand something. What she knew was the kitchen. The stove, the herbs, the window with the dark coming in, the sound of children upstairs, the third peg from the door, the things that were hers now, if she chose to claim them. She stirred the pot, and the kitchen warmed, and she stayed. Winter released its grip on Wyoming the way it always did. Not all at once, not with any particular grace, but in the grudging, incremental way of something that had held territory for months and was not giving it up without argument. February brought a false thaw that lasted 4 days and fooled nobody who had lived through a Wyoming winter before. The snow pulled back from the south-facing slopes, the eaves dripped in the afternoons, and Clara declared that spring was coming with the absolute confidence of an 8-year-old who had decided to be done with winter. Then February brought another week of hard cold that froze the meltwater into sheet ice across every path on the property, and Evelyn spent 2 mornings spreading ash from the fireplace across the worst of it, so nobody broke an ankle getting to the barn, and Clara revised her declaration without comment. March came in gray and mean and left the same way, but April was different. April meant it. Evelyn was in the garden on a Wednesday morning in the second week of April when she finally felt it. Not just the temperature, which had been reasonable for a week, but the quality of the air, the way the light was doing something different on the north field, the smell of the ground coming back to itself after months of being frozen past smelling like anything. She'd been turning soil in the kitchen garden, working the winter compaction out of it, and she stopped with the fork in her hands and just stood there for a moment and felt the sun on her face with her eyes closed. She heard boots behind her. "You're standing still," Silas said. That's unusual." "The ground's ready," she said. "I can feel it." He came to stand beside her and looked at the turned soil. He had a coffee cup in his hand. He'd taken to bringing her coffee in the mornings when she was outside, a habit that had started sometime in January and had continued without either of them remarking on it. "What are you putting in first?" he asked. "Peas, then the root vegetables. Clara wants to try melons, but I told her we'd see what the summer looks like." "She'll campaign for the melons." "She's already campaigning. She made a written argument." Evelyn took the coffee. It was quite thorough. He almost laughed. It was a real laugh, very nearly. She could hear it in the breath he let out, the way his face moved. He'd been doing that more since January, not performing ease, just occasionally arriving at it. That was the thing about Silas Boone that she'd come to understand over the winter months. He didn't pretend. He didn't manage his face for company or arrange himself into positions of reassurance. When he was struggling, you could see it, and when he wasn't, you could see that too, and there was no performance layered on top of either state. She had spent 2 years around people who performed normalcy, performed judgment, performed the version of themselves that the story about her required. And a man who simply was what he was in any given moment had taken some adjusting to. She'd adjusted. She took a drink of the coffee and handed it back and picked up the fork again, and they stayed there in the spring morning, not talking, the way they'd gotten comfortable not talking, and the Wyoming sky opened up above them enormous and blue and completely indifferent to any of it. He asked her to marry him on a Sunday in late April. She hadn't seen it coming, which surprised her because she was generally good at seeing things coming, but he'd chosen a moment that was genuinely ordinary. She was mending a shirt at the kitchen table after Sunday supper. Clara was reading in the front room. Rosie was asleep. And he sat down across from her and put both hands flat on the table and said without preamble, "I want to marry you." She looked up from the shirt. He met her eyes. He was not nervous exactly, but she could see that he'd been carrying the question for a while and was relieved to be setting it down. I know it's not a small thing to ask," he said. "I know there are reasons it's complicated. I'm not asking you to decide right now, but I wanted to say it plain." Evelyn set down the needle. "Silas," she said. "You can say no," he said. "I mean that. If it's not what you want, I'd rather know. I'm not going to... Nothing changes here if that's not what you want. I need you to know that." She looked at him across the kitchen table. She thought about the gate she'd stood at in October, the road stretching away in both directions, and the decision she'd made to turn back. She thought about Rosie reaching through the crib slats. She thought about Clara's written argument for melons. precise and earnest and completely characteristic. She thought about the third peg from the door, the one that was hers now. She thought about what she'd understood, somewhere in the long dark hours of the blizzard night, sitting in the rocking chair with a feverish baby against her shoulder. That belonging somewhere was not given to you. It was not a thing that arrived when you found the right place or the right people. It was a thing you built, action by action, night by night, choice by ordinary choice, until one day you looked up and found that you had made something that was yours because you'd put yourself into it until the seams held. She had put herself into this. Yes, she said. He looked at her. Yes, she said again, more plainly, because she could see he needed to hear it twice. Something moved across his face. Not the overwhelming rush of a man who'd been afraid of the answer, but the quieter thing of a man who had hoped and had been right to hope, and was now simply taking that in. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and she turned her hand over and they sat like that for a moment in the kitchen that smelled like supper and wood smoke and the herbs coming back in the window box. Clara's going to have opinions, Evelyn said. Clara has opinions about everything. More than usual about this. Probably. He looked at their hands. She already told me I should ask you. Evelyn looked at him. She did. 2 weeks ago, she sat me down and said, Papa, you should ask Evelyn. She's not going to wait forever. He paused. She's 8 years old. She's an old soul, Evelyn said. She gets it from her mother. He said it without flinching, and she heard the difference from how he'd once said things about Hannah. The rawness that had been in it before. The way the name had cost him something every time he used it. It still cost him something. It always would. But it was a different cost now. The cost of missing, rather than the cost of not yet having learned how to carry the missing. She squeezed his hand. Hannah would have been glad, she said. Not because she knew it to be true, but because she believed it, and she'd decided some time ago that what she believed deserved to be said out loud. He was quiet for a moment. Yeah, he said. I think she would have. They married in June at the ranch, in the early morning before the heat of the day set in properly. There was no elaborate ceremony. There was a justice of the peace who rode out from Hadley Crossing, and there was Wade and Francis, and there was Mabel Harding, who arrived 40 minutes early and immediately went to the kitchen to see what needed doing. Clara wore her best dress, which she had pressed herself the night before with a seriousness of purpose that suggested she understood the gravity of the occasion better than some adults Evelyn had known. Rosie wore a dress that Frances had made from cloth she'd brought out from town, white with a small yellow edge at the collar, and she walked 6 unsteady steps across the porch before sitting down hard on her bottom and accepting the situation. It was not a flawless morning. The justice of the peace's horse had thrown a shoe on the road out, and he arrived late and slightly flustered. Mabel burned the bottom of one pan of biscuits, which gave Evelyn a complicated feeling she had to work not to smile at. The vows Silas had thought through carefully came out slightly different than he'd planned them. She could tell by the small pause mid-sentence. The recalibration and the version that came out was better than whatever he'd originally intended, rougher and more true. She said yes to what he asked her. She asked him to stay, to be present, to build something real even when real was hard. He said yes to that. Wade shook her hand after. Not the formal handshake of that first day in the yard, the one that had been its own kind of warning. This was different. He took her hand and held it for a moment and looked at her with the direct, slightly uncomfortable expression of a man who had been wrong and had not forgotten it. I'm glad you didn't listen to me, he said. You weren't entirely wrong, she said. You were worried about your brother. I was wrong about you specifically. Yes, she said. You were. He almost smiled. You're not going to let me off easy. No, she said, but I'm going to let you off. He did smile then, a real one, the same one she'd seen briefly on Silas, the family resemblance most visible in moments of actual amusement. Fair enough, he said. Frances hugged her. Mabel patted her arm in the brisk way of someone who considered extended physical contact an indulgence, but had decided the occasion warranted at least a moment of it. Clara stood beside Evelyn through most of the morning with the quiet, settled air of someone whose work was done. Not the relief of someone who'd been afraid of an outcome. Clara had apparently never been afraid of this outcome, having decided it before her father had, but the satisfaction of someone who had seen a thing clearly and watched the world catch up to what she'd already known. You're officially my mother now, Clara said in the afternoon, matter-of-factly. Evelyn looked at her. I am. I know you already were, mostly, Clara said, but now it's official. She considered this. I prefer official. Evelyn put her arm around the girl's shoulders, and Clara leaned into it with the easy, unconscious comfort of someone who had been doing that for a while now and didn't think of it as a thing she was doing. Me too, Evelyn said. The years that followed were not easy years, because no years on the frontier were, and anyone who told you otherwise was selling something. There were bad seasons. A summer drought 2 years in that took most of the kitchen garden and required them to buy feed for the horses at prices that made the ledger look grim for most of the fall. A year when the cattle prices dropped and they ran the ranch on careful, inventive frugality for 8 months and came out the other side intact, but only barely. A winter when Clara had a chest illness that kept her in bed for 6 weeks and scared them both in ways neither of them talked about directly after she recovered. Silas had difficult stretches. The grief didn't vanish because he'd built something new on top of it. It lived underneath, the way grief did, and there were days when it came up through the floor and he went quiet in a particular way that Evelyn had learned to read. On those days she didn't push, and she didn't pretend, and she didn't require him to be further along than he was. She let him carry it, and she stayed near, and eventually he'd come back to the surface and find her still there. She had her own difficult stretches. The story about her didn't disappear from the territory just because she'd stopped running from it. There were people in Hadley Crossing who had decided things about her and were not going to undecide them, and she learned to move through that with the same practicality she brought to everything else. Registering it, declining to be flattened by it, moving on. What helped was having something to move back to. It was harder to be diminished by other people's stories when you went home to a place that knew your real one. Rosie grew into herself the way children did, not gradually, not in the straight upward line you expected, but in sudden increments, as if she'd been storing up change and released it all at once. At 2, she was walking and running and falling over with equal enthusiasm. At 3, she discovered that she had opinions about everything, and that sharing them at volume was her preference. At 4, she followed the cattle dog around the property for an entire afternoon attempting to teach it to sit, which the dog declined, but the persistence was impressive. At 5, she asked Evelyn what a doctor did, and then asked why women couldn't be doctors, and Evelyn gave her the honest, complicated answer, which was that some people said they couldn't, but that some people were wrong, and Rosie filed this away with the focused attention of someone receiving useful intelligence. Clara, watching from the doorway during this conversation, caught Evelyn's eye. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. Clara nodded slowly with the expression of someone recognizing a pattern. It was Clara who ultimately articulated what nobody had said directly. She was 12 by then, and she'd grown into the watchful intelligence of her childhood rather than out of it. Sharper now, more precise, with a habit of reading that had given her a vocabulary that ran ahead of most adults she encountered. She was sitting with Evelyn on the porch one evening while Silas was in the barn, and Rosie was somewhere in the yard doing something that involved a great deal of serious conversation with herself. "Can I ask you something?" Clara said. "You always ask before you ask," Evelyn said. "Just ask." Clara looked at the yard. "Were you happy before you came here?" Evelyn considered the question the way it deserved. "No," she said. "Not for a while." "Because of what happened in Laramie?" "Partly, and partly because I'd gotten so focused on moving away from things that I'd stopped thinking about what I was moving toward. And when you're not moving toward anything, you're just—" She paused. "You're just moving." Clara turned this over. "Do you think you would have stopped, eventually, even without this?" "I don't know," Evelyn said honestly. "I'd like to think so, but I don't know what would have stopped me." She looked at the yard where Rosie had apparently concluded her conversation with herself and was now examining something near the fence post with intense focus. "Sometimes you don't stop yourself. Sometimes something stops you." "Rosie's crying stopped you," Clara said. "Rosie's crying stopped me," Evelyn agreed. Clara was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I'm glad she was crying." "Me too," Evelyn said. "I'm glad you came in," Clara said. Instead of walking away, Evelyn looked at the girl. 12 years old, serious and bright, and entirely herself, the daughter of a woman she'd never met, and the stepdaughter of a woman who had walked in off the road because a baby was crying. Clara was going to be something. Evelyn had known it since the first week, when an 8-year-old had sat on the floor beside a crib all night with a water basin and done exactly what was needed without being old enough to have any business doing it. "I'm glad too," she said. "Every day I'm glad." The thing about Edmund Prescott resolved itself, as things sometimes did, without anyone having to do anything directly. It was Wade who told her, on a visit in the fall of the 3rd year. He'd been to Cheyenne for business and had run into a man from Laramie, and the man had told him that Prescott's land speculation operation had collapsed under the weight of a fraud investigation, not related to Evelyn, not related to anything she'd been part of, but the kind of investigation that happened when a man who had been operating cleverly for long enough finally got careless or finally ran into someone who wouldn't be managed. His reputation was gone. His seat on the town council was gone. His wife had taken the children to her family in Denver. Evelyn listened to this standing in the kitchen with a dish towel in her hand. "I thought you'd want to know," Wade said. "I appreciate it," she said. He waited, as if expecting something more, satisfaction, perhaps, or vindication, or some version of what he might have felt in her position. She thought about it. She looked for those things and found something, but it was quieter than what he was probably expecting. Not triumph, something more like the closing of a parenthesis. The sentence that had been left open for 3 years finally reaching its end. "Good," she said simply. "I hope those children are all right." Wade looked at her. "That's all? What else is there?" She hung the dish towel. "It doesn't undo anything. It doesn't give back the year I spent walking." She paused. "But it means the story ends the way it should. That matters." He nodded slowly. He'd done a lot of slow nodding over the years. Wade had. She'd come to read it as his version of respect, the acknowledgement of something he hadn't expected. "You're a harder person to rattle than most," he said. "I've had practice," she said. He stayed for supper that night, and Frances came out the following afternoon, and they sat on the porch in the September warmth and talked about nothing consequential. And Rosie climbed into Wade's lap uninvited and immediately began telling him about the dog's most recent failings as a working animal. And Wade bore this with the expression of a man who had decided some time ago that Rosie Boone was one of his favorite people and was not going to let her know that because it would only encourage her. Silas caught Evelyn's eye across the porch. She looked back at him. 3 years had changed him in the ways that time and steadiness changed a person. The grief was carried differently now, with more ease, not gone but integrated. He laughed more than he had, real laughing, the kind that arrived without management. He'd let himself start wanting things again, which was the hardest part, she thought, of recovering from loss. Allowing yourself to want things when you knew that wanting things meant risking losing them. He'd wanted her to stay, and she'd stayed, and the want had been worth the risk. She understood that from her own side, too. She'd been so focused on not wanting things, not wanting to be hurt, not wanting to trust, not wanting to let herself be somewhere long enough for it to matter, that she'd almost walked past the one gate she should have gone through. She'd almost kept walking. The margin had been thin. A baby's cry, a child's upturned face at a gate, the decision made in the space between one step and the next. You made the decisions without knowing what they cost or what they gave. That was the thing nobody told you, that the biggest decisions of your life often didn't announce themselves. They arrived disguised as small moments. A door you could have walked past. A question you could have deflected. A gate you could have latched behind you and kept going. The courage wasn't in the dramatic thing. The courage was in the stopping. On an October evening, 5 years after she'd walked in off the road with a canteen and nothing else, Evelyn stood on the porch of Iron Ridge Ranch and watched the last of the day go out of the sky. The yard below her was not quiet. Silas was at the fence line on the near pasture. She could see him from here. The familiar shape of him, the way he moved when he was working, methodical and unhurried. Rosie was somewhere near the barn, audible if not visible, conducting some operation that required the cooperation of the cattle dog, who was, as always, a reluctant partner. Clara's lamp was on in the upstairs window, which meant she was reading, which was where Clara was most evenings now, working through the stack of medical texts that Dr. Hale in Grover Falls had started lending her after she'd spent an afternoon asking him questions he'd found impossible not to answer seriously. Clara was going to be a doctor. Evelyn had known it for 2 years, had suspected it longer than that. The way the girl absorbed information, the way she'd sat through the blizzard night at 4 in the morning with a water basin in her lap and tracked her sister's fever with the focused calm of someone doing a job, that was an accident. That was character arriving early. Dr. Hale had told Silas at Christmas that he'd never had a student half her age ask half her questions, and that if she wanted to study medicine properly, there were ways to make that happen. Clara had the written argument already prepared. Evelyn had seen it on the desk. It was thorough. The October air was cold in the clean way, the sharp way, the way that smelled of everything going to rest for winter. The turned earth of the kitchen garden, the last of the hay brought in that afternoon, wood smoke from the chimney behind her where the fire had been going since late afternoon. The Wyoming sky was doing what Wyoming sky did in October, which was put on a performance that had nothing modest in it. The color moving from the pale gold of the last light through orange and into the deep blue that preceded dark, and the first stars appearing at the edge of it, very far away and very clear. She thought about Laramie. She did that sometimes, still, not often, not with the weight it had once had, but the way you thought about a place you'd been that had shaped you, with a kind of detached recognition. Edmund Prescott had ended badly. The story he'd told about her was still somewhere in the territory, probably the way stories stayed once they'd gotten loose, but it had lost its momentum. The people who'd heard it had other things to think about now, and she had stopped being relevant to their calculations. She had stopped being a story in other people's mouths and had become instead a person in her own life. That was the thing she wanted to say to the woman she'd been 5 years ago, standing at a stranger's gate with her pack on her shoulder and her boot sole giving out in 11 months of running in her body like sediment. She wanted to say, "You will not outrun it by moving. The only way out is through, and through means stopping, and stopping means being willing to be seen in one place long enough for people to see you clearly. It means doing the work without knowing if anyone will credit you for it. It means opening a door you have no claim on and going in anyway because something on the other side needs you. It means being afraid and doing it anyway, which is the only definition of courage that has ever mattered. She was afraid still, on the bad days. She was imperfect, still, in the ways she'd always been imperfect. Impatient with slowness, too direct when gentle would have served better, inclined to take on more than she should, and then resent the weight before apologizing for the resentment. She and Silas argued sometimes, genuinely argued, in the low, honest way of two people who respected each other enough to disagree and stubborn enough to hold their positions past the point of comfort. She didn't always win. He didn't always win. The arguments resolved the way good arguments resolved, not with a winner, but with something better than either position had been before the argument. She was not perfect. The ranch was not perfect. The family she had stumbled into and then chosen and then built, piece by piece, over 5 years of ordinary days. It was not the story she would have written if she'd been writing stories. It had grief in it, and difficulty, and the ongoing, unromantic work of maintaining something real. Hannah Boone's absence was woven into the fabric of the place, and always would be. The children carried their mother with them in ways that were sometimes painful and always worth honoring, but it was hers. That was the thing, not by birthright or by luck or by someone else's deciding, but by the accumulation of choices she'd made when she could have made the other choice. She heard the gate latch below. Silas coming in from the fence line, his coat dirty at the knees from where he'd been kneeling to work at the post. He looked up when he came through the gate and saw her on the porch and raised a hand. Not a wave, just a gesture, the acknowledgement of one person to another that they'd been seen. She raised her hand back. He came up the porch steps and stopped beside her and looked at the sky, doing what the sky was doing, and said nothing for a moment because that was how he was. "Good day?" he asked finally. "Good day," she said. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into the warmth of him, and they stood together in the October evening and watched the light go out of the Wyoming sky the way it went out every evening, without asking permission and without waiting to be appreciated. Below them in the yard, Rosie shrieked with laughter about something. The dog, probably, some fresh act of canine independence. The lamp in Clara's window held its steady rectangle of light against the coming dark. The fire in the stove behind the kitchen window glowed. Evelyn had walked a long, difficult road to find herself standing on this porch, in this cold, watching this particular light. She had opened a door she had no business opening and walked through it, and everything that mattered had been on the other side. She had stopped running. She had stayed. And the staying, the daily, unglamorous, imperfect act of staying, had built a life she would not have traded for any other. The stars came out over Iron Ridge, clear and cold and enormous, and the house behind them held its heat against the night, and the family it contained was present and whole. And Evelyn Cross Boone stood on her porch in the dark and felt, without fanfare, without performance, without any story to tell about it, except the plain and sufficient truth, that she was home.